Good morning, ladies and gents. Welcome once again to SAWMA 2021, our 50th anniversary. Just a reminder, we are now live around the world. Welcome to our virtual delegates. Lovely to have you in the room with us. Just before we get underway with the proceedings this morning, just a few announcements for those of you who are here in person. If you see any power boxes that are covered with green tape, please do not use those boxes because that is for our various AV pieces of equipment. So please don't open them and use the plugs in there. Folks, if you are speaking here in person, we have fully sanitized earpieces for microphones. So just before your talk, please head up to the student assistants who are over on this side in the front of the venue. Who will mic you up after they have sanitized the earpieces, all right? And they will show you how to use those microphones. So please do that before you come up and speak so that you are ready for your session and your talk. And then finally, as I mentioned last night, there are two standalone microphones in the hall that you can see. They are on. So if we have question time, enough time for questions, and you have a question, a burning question, please get up and stand behind the microphone, and in this session I will ask you to ask your question if we have time. So folks, without any further ado, it is just about time to go. I'm going to call on our AV team to please play the welcoming and the official opening of SAWMA 2021 by the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Mpumalanga. Thank you, gents.
Sanibonani, Dumelang, Ausheni, Loshani, Dimasheroni, Molweni, good morning, Goeiemorgen, Namaste, distinguished guests and colleagues. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome you this morning and to officially open the 50th anniversary conference of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association with the theme, Wildlife Management in the 21st Century, Adapt or Die. On behalf of the University of Mpumalanga, I would like to express our appreciation for the opportunity to be part of this auspicious occasion in the developmental trajectory of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association, the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the association. It is indeed an honor for the University of Mpumalanga as a new university to host this conference. In this regard, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of Professor Dan Parker, the outgoing president of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association, and his colleagues in the preparation for the conference. We value such experiences as part of our pioneering journey, Luhambo lwemhlahlandlela. As the conference is a hybrid event, I would like to extend a special word of welcome to the delegates who are attending in person, as well as those who will be attending virtually. To those of you coming from outside the borders of South Africa, welcome to South Africa. And to those of you coming from outside the province of Mpumalanga, welcome to Mpumalanga, the place of the rising sun. The rays of the sun are a powerful symbol for the university, representing life, warmth, and energy. The warmth is not only of the province, but of the people generally. As the University of Mpumalanga, we love our location and would not want to exchange it for anything. A word of welcome to the following plenary speakers: Dr. Mudumba, Professor Hetem, Dr. Funda, Dr. Schremer, Professor Hayward, and Professor Broders. It is encouraging to note that many of the delegates are postgraduate students. This is evidence of the commitment of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association to build the next generation of scientists. The themes that will be covered at the conference, which includes people and conservation, conservation success stories, wildlife management challenges, and the future of wildlife management and conservation, to mention but a few, drive home the point of visionary and future-oriented thinking, which not only focuses on the here and now, but forward-looking and solution-oriented. There is a clear alignment between the conference theme and the strategic direction of our institution. Our vision as the UMP is to be an African university leading in creating opportunities for sustainable development through innovation. Our mission is to offer high-quality educational and training opportunities that foster the holistic development of students through teaching and learning, research and scholarship, and engagement in collaboration with strategic partners. We are guided in our ventures by the following crucial values: excellence, integrity, diversity, collaboration, adaptability, relevance, and inspiration. A number of our values find expression at this conference. As an engaged university, our institution places great value on partnerships, collaborations, linkages, and networks, and we have identified partnerships as both drivers and enablers in achieving our vision. At a strategic level, and in line with UMP's Vision 2022, our goal is to make a pioneering, critical, and constructive contribution through the production and dissemination of knowledge. We are committed to using the university's knowledge assets to actively and creatively promote a vibrant economic, social, and political democracy in which all sections of society, particularly the poor, can find opportunities to explore and a meaningful place in society. The key issues of access, inclusion, transformation, belonging, and deriving benefit from the economic value chain by communities previously excluded should be jealously guarded going forward. Setbacks imposed by COVID-19 restrictions, with your collective creativity and innovation, will certainly be turned into future opportunities. We strongly believe that knowledge and skills are key assets to enable effective advancement and deepening of the quality and scope of democratic life in the world. I wish you an enjoyable conference and fruitful deliberations. My wish is that as you bring your collective wisdom to bear on issues of profound significance for our country and for generations yet to come, you will enlighten one another, inspire one another, and when sharp points of difference emerge, you will resolve these with rigor and tenacity. The gratifying part of the conference is when delegates can leave with concrete strategies and insights that they can apply with immediacy, what we call the low-hanging fruit, the quick wins that provide a foundation to build upon in the future. Please take time to get to know our province and its scenic views and its breathtaking surroundings, such as the tree rondavels, the potholes, God's Window, Sudwala Caves, Pilgrim's Rest, Blythe River Canyon Nature Reserve, and of course, our city. May you leave the conference the richer in many respects, especially intellectually and aesthetically.
Thank you very much, Professor Mayakiso, for those opening remarks and for officially opening our 2021 conference. So, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us to the really important part of why we are here, and we're going to have our first session this morning, which is People and Conservation. And it's my great pleasure to welcome our first plenary for the next 4 days, Dr. Louise SAWMA, who is a social scientist for South African National Parks, SANParks. Much of Louise's work is centered around community-engaged projects which seek to prioritize the sustainability of conservation. And as such, the title of her talk this morning is It's Not About the Numbers, the Contribution of Conservation Social Science Towards Protected Area Sustainability. Thank you very much, Louise.
Thanks, Dan, and good morning to everybody. It's really nice to be here in a real conference. So well done to everybody for pulling it off so far. Okay, so should we get started? Right, well, thanks very much for this opportunity to share some of our stories with you this morning. I'm going to be talking about protected areas, about people, and about social science research. And I think, you know, a really great way to start off is to just maybe read this quote together. So protected areas are viewed as a critical component of a life support system, and they're expected to do more in terms of their ecological, economic, and social contributions. I think that's extremely important. You know, we've got all these protected areas across the world. Some of them have been around for a really long time, but are they doing enough for society to sort of justify their existence? And this is something that certainly has to change, and it's something that we've been trying to focus on for the last 20 years or so in SANParks. And just sort of to share the context of that background slide, that's of course has taken a very long time ago in Kruger, when it was enough for Kruger to be there for visitors to come and enjoy. And that certainly is a context that has changed. So don't worry about all that text. I think just focus on the red bits. And this is just some extracts from the National Parks legislation, just to show you how things actually have changed over time. So the first one is a really old one. That's the very first National Parks Act from 1926. And you see there that they say that the purpose of a protected area is for the benefit and enjoyment of the visitor. And that's it. That is why those parks were established in those days. And that didn't change much in 1976. And it was only in 2003 where you start seeing these words like ecosystem goods and services, sustainable use, and people coming into the realm. So that's relatively recent in the history of conservation. So just to sort of show how the vision and mission of SANParks has also changed over time, I think what's important to note there is that those red words, again, that you can't see, I don't think, but words like sustainable coming out. Sustainable are incredibly important, and also that we are doing this for the just and equitable benefit of people. So I'm going to focus quite a lot on that last little bit that I've highlighted in the bubble. So how are we sharing benefits from protected areas for the just and equitable benefit of future generations? And I'm going to have to tell you about it, not show you, it looks like. Okay, so let's start off with this one. And so it was nice to hear that there's so many students here, because I think that means that you might not have seen this slide. I think all the older people are very familiar with this slide. And maybe I should ask a question before we even go further. How many people have presented at a SAWMA conference not using PowerPoint in the past? Put your hands up. So how many have used other things like transparencies and pieces of paper in the very old days? So things have changed. I mean, that's amazing. That wasn't that many hands. So maybe I'm good with this slide. Okay, so we still can't see it, but I think the point is that, protected areas are here for biodiversity conservation, and that's kind of a globally accepted phenomenon. We're here to protect biodiversity. Is it something that I'm doing? Okay, so should I just carry on? Okay, so I think the important thing about biodiversity protection is that it's not just there for the sake of biodiversity. We're protecting biodiversity because there's an intrinsic or a moral reason. We are the humans, we are the ones that are actually contributing to the demise of the planet and causing all these threats to biodiversity. But then there's also this other component to do with human benefits. So it's part of our mandate. We're protecting biodiversity because we have to and we should. It's morally right, but also because we want humans to benefit from it, and not just a few humans. And if we're going to do that, we've got to be sustainable. So that doesn't have to be sandparks in that middle component. That can be really any protected area or any sort of biodiversity-related area. But I think the important thing are those three things at the top. So those are those pillars of sustainability that you would have learned about a lot over the last little while, maybe at university or over time. But I think remaining ecologically intact is important. It's critical, but it's not everything. We've got to also be economically viable. We have to maintain standards and to be able to operate and grow. And then, of course, we've got to be socially relevant. And I think that's the part that I find the most exciting and the most challenging and the most important. We've got to be socially relevant and not just to a selected few. So that's where I do most of my work, is looking at those links between, trying to make sure that benefits are distributed in a way that leads to social relevance to a broad lot of stakeholder groups. And we've got to do that because it's our mandate, but we also have to do that because it's important for the sustainability of conservation, and it provides incentives for people to support this as a process. And then, of course, within South Africa and some of the other Southern African countries, we've got to do that within the context of social and environmental justice, because we haven't always. That's not always how the protected areas were established in the early days. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too. So you can't really talk about a protected area like Kruger without touching a little bit on the history. And I think the point of this slide is really to emphasize and to remind us that people have always been part of this Kruger landscape. So as much as it was kind of proclaimed in 1926 as this beautiful wilderness sort of area, people have developed as part of this landscape together with the wildlife, together with the plants and animals and things, actually as a really important driver. Okay, so it's not something new. So when we started moving people out of the park, we actually removed quite an important kind of natural driver of the ecosystem. So the other interesting thing is that towards the late 1800s, game numbers in this area were really on the decline. There was almost nothing left. It was because of overhunting by the colonial elite mostly, and then also because of rinderpest. So there was a massive rinderpest outbreak which decimated wildlife and livestock. So that got people concerned, and that's really what led to the very early establishment of those two precursors of the Kruger Park, which was the Shingwetsi Game Reserve and then the Sabi Game Reserve in the south. The interesting thing was those were established partly so that animals would persist for hunting to be able to continue. That was one of the objectives back in those early days. By 1926, it was clear that that wasn't working. Game numbers weren't really increasing. And that's really when the sort of different approach to conservation came in. So that was where the protectionist approach came in, kind of borrowed over from the North America Yellowstone model. And that's where we started seeing things like exclusionary principles. People were removed out of parks such as Kruger. And that, of course, coincided with the former apartheid era in South Africa, where other people were forcibly removed from areas in the country into areas next to the Kruger National Park. And that persisted for a lot of time. So, I mean, right up until the 90s, that's a lot of the history of the park, okay, that is characterized by that approach to conservation. Of course, that changed with democracy. And that, of course, was, quite a while ago now. So there's been a lot of change since then. So another important part of history is the establishment of the TFCA, added another 1 million hectares of conservation onto the eastern boundary of Kruger. And that, of course, was pretty different in that it had both social as well as biodiversity objectives to it from the beginning. Okay, so the result of kind of some of that dodgy history is that we've got this amazing landscape, it's beautiful. That's why we're here today, and that's why a lot of us are studied and land up doing this kind of stuff, is because we had the privilege of having access to this landscape when we were growing up. Of course, many, many people didn't have that privilege. So this is what we're sitting with. But what we're also sitting with is a landscape that's embedded within this kind of quite complex sort of matrix of land uses. We've got over 1,000 kilometers of boundary. The Kruger Park, there's a lot of boundary. And it's obviously socially, politically, and economically complex. And I think what's important is that a lot of the areas where we directly abut areas of very high densities of people, there's a lot of unemployment. People are very dependent on social grants and subsistence agriculture. And this, of course, is important context when we're talking about sharing benefits for the broader good and for the people living in these areas. And it's not an easy task, but it's an important sort of context. The other thing that's interesting is that we have both hard and soft boundary. So what we call a soft boundary is where we abut some sort of conservation land use. There was a nice little fancy pen. Let's see if it works. Can you see my dot? Okay. So this is what we would call a soft boundary. All these areas here where there's some sort of conservation land use, and this would be a hard boundary over here where there's a lot of people directly abutting conservation. And that, of course, has implications for how we engage with people in those areas. So we're going to talk a lot about benefits for the next 40 minutes, and I think it's important to define what these are. So we define a benefit as any impact as a result of an engagement with the natural environment that has got a positive outcome on well-being. Okay, so I'm not just going to use that word well-being flippantly, because it's important that we understand what goes into that. So there's a whole lot of components in this basket of well-being. So when we talk about benefits, it's not just the material stuff. It's not just the food. It's not just the shelter. It's also the physical components, so being healthy, social components, spiritual components, as well as having security and feeling safe, okay, and having the freedom to choose and make decisions around yourself. So those are really important things when we talk about the impact of protected areas on people. It's not just the physical impacts, it's also the psychological and intangible components as well. The other thing is that benefits go hand in hand with costs. So any of those impacts, if they have a negative impact on well-being, then we would call that a cost. A lot of the components of well-being are intangible, so they're hard to measure, they're hard to sort of acknowledge and count, and that makes them often forgotten about. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on for the rest of my talk. So the other important thing is that benefits are perception-based. Thank you. A benefit is not something you can teach somebody. Some people have to feel, you have to feel a benefit. It's something that you've got to actually embed within yourself and to be able to appreciate it. And stakeholders differ. They differ in the way that they value and prioritize benefits. All of us, so all of us sitting here today, we've got SAWMA in common, we're super excited, we love, learning and researching about these things. But if we had to choose a movie to watch, do you think that we'd all choose the same movie? We wouldn't. So all of us are different and we make different decisions based on our own kind of worldviews. So what this means is that what might be perceived as a benefit for one person might be perceived by another person as a cost at a certain space, at a certain time frame. So there's an example. You've got an elephant on the left-hand side that's experiencing that tourist in a very directly positive aesthetic way. On the right-hand side, you might have somebody farming, crop farmer, that will experience that elephant in a very directly livelihood cost way. So you're kind of weighing up these costs and benefits, intangible kind of benefits on the left, tangible costs on the right, and you're not really comparing apples and pears, so it's not that easy. So managing benefits is really about managing trade-offs. And trade-offs are going to happen. We don't live in a perfect world where you can sort of slice the pie up evenly. So you've got to manage these processes, and it's basically a continuing journey. There's not really such thing as getting a balance, okay? The other important concept around this is that there's this issue of net impact. And you've got to understand that if you want to get to this point where people are going to value an area, have vested interest in conservation, and then develop some sort of conservation-minded attitude and behavior that sort of led all of us to work in this field. and that will eventually lead to social relevance. So this net impact is the trade-off between costs and benefits. So for the rest of my talk, and that was just the intro, so I hope you're super comfy, I'm going to just talk a bit more about social science. So how do we use social science to understand what sort of costs and benefits flow from a protected area like Kruger? And then how do we look at those impacts in terms of their impact on well-being? Because we've said that well-being is really important. It's not just about the numbers. And I'm going to use some resource examples. So I'm going to work, I work mostly in Kruger, so I'm going to use the Kruger context to unpack some of that stuff. And then I'm going to take a bit of a step back and look at science more generally, and sort of look at, whether science is actually making a difference. So is the stuff that we're doing making a difference to biodiversity conservation? And I'm going to use some examples from SAWMA. Okay? So in terms of what costs and benefits are flowing, this is also a familiar slide from me, and we're not going to go into it all, but I think the point is that there's a lot of stuff happening, there's a lot of stuff flowing. The four main categories, I could actually make stuff up, and you wouldn't know. The four main categories that we really talk about are the benefits associated with employment. That's a big one. We've spoken about unemployment in these areas. So the benefits of employment are big. Benefits associated with capacity building. Benefits associated with infrastructure support. So those are things like educational infrastructure as well as service delivery. Not always things that people would traditionally think come from conservation areas, but of course it's important to people, so it's important to us. And then there's a whole lot of stuff linked to direct benefits from the ecosystem, such as your ecosystem goods and services. And I'm going to talk a bit more about those, especially in the context of resource use. And then there's this sort of cluster on the right-hand side that you can't see, but it's the components around managing relationships and restoring rights. And that's incredibly important because we talk about benefits, but, undoing injustices from the past is not necessarily a benefit. It's actually a right, and it's things that we have to do anyway. Okay, so that's actually the fifth one over there. Okay, so there's lots of different examples amongst all of these, and I'm not going to go into those in any more detail, but a lot of it is summarized in this book, so if anybody wants that, it is on our website. But I think what we found from that process of kind of doing a benefits audit is that it's complicated. And when we just look at the numbers, so we came up with this framework where we noticed that actually the majority of the people that are benefiting from Kruger are benefiting in these ways, which are sort of aesthetic and cultural and intangible kind of ways. So 2 million tourists coming into Kruger every year, okay? And the sort of fewer numbers of people that are benefiting in these direct sort of livelihood, really, really important kind of ways. 3,000 people employed, X many people that participate in tangible resource use projects and so on. What's interesting is that it was almost like an inverse relationship. So the relative fraction of the people that were benefiting was inversely proportional to the fraction of people that are incurring costs. And most of the people benefiting are not the ones that are bearing the costs. So those are really important points when we talk about sharing benefits. We can't just talk about the big numbers. We've actually got to go and look at some of the trade-offs between costs and benefits. So I've been saying it's not about the numbers. I've been just talking about the numbers, so I'm going to now talk about some of the intangible stuff as well. But I think to do that, we've got to look at this. So, I think on the left-hand side, we've got this biophysical system. We've got Kruger, we've got protected areas, we've got whatever we have on the one hand. And we know from that a whole lot of costs and benefits flow. But we're not really sure how they flow exactly. So there's a whole lot of stuff that happens between your biophysical template that you have and all of these costs and benefits that flow at the end of the day. And we believe that happens through ecosystem services. You must look quickly now, because, okay. And then also through the concept of ecosystem products. So an example is net primary production would be something that comes from the ecosystem. Woody biomass would be an ecosystem service. Firewood would be an ecosystem product. And then having cooked food or having heat would be the benefit. So those are not all the same thing. So you can't just report on ecosystem services and think you're reporting on benefits. It sounds a bit like semantics, but why it's important, and now you can't see this awesome thing that I want to show you. But it's important because it builds value. And if you understand the impacts on well-being, that's really where the value comes from. It's not from the ecosystem service. It's from the impact on the well-being. Okay? And that's really what feeds into having vested interest. Look quickly. Feeds into having vested interest, and that's what feeds into some sort of pro or anti-conservation behavior. There's a lot of stuff that happens as well. This is just a simplistic depiction of why we use well-being to develop value. So how does our understanding of this stuff work? So we know a lot about the biophysical system. That's what a lot of people in this room are understanding, and we have done for a lot of years. We don't know a lot about how the patterns and processes that we map contribute to ecosystem services. We actually don't. So when we try and quantify all that stuff, we know we're not always sure how that feeds into a service. We know a lot about the products. We can tell you how many people get this, how many people participate, but we can't actually tell you about how it impacts on their well-being over there. So we don't have a very good understanding of that. And then we also don't really understand how that feeds into value and how that feeds into pro-conservation behavior. So I'm going to focus on the sad faces for the next little while. And I'm going to try and do that through using a resource use example from Kruger, the harvesting of mapani worms. But before that, I think what's important, how many people have eaten a mapani worm? Whoa, better. So the youth have eaten mapani worms, but they have never used a transparency to give a presentation. I don't know which one is more scary. Okay, so I think what's important is we look at a bit of context around resource use. So we must remember that it's resource use in sandparks has got a long history, and it's got a very wide scope. We've got 20 national parks, so resources are used in a number of different ways in a number of different areas. There's different projects and programs. In Kruger, there's tourism infrastructure that we use resources for. We use revenue generation, we sell animals, we use resources when we're managing biodiversity, as well as to provide benefits. Don't worry too much about the detail, but we're not doing anything illegal, and you can have a look in the slide if you want to understand some more about the governance. So it's really supported by all different levels of governance for us to do these things. Okay, so the Mapani Worm project started in 2010, and the idea was that there's not a lot of worms outside. It's a really important protein source. It gets over-harvested, and there's always not always, but there's sometimes huge outbreaks, and we thought there might be a way that we can provide access for people to harvest resources inside, and in a controlled way, in a very small fraction of the Mapani worm veld when there is a large outbreak. So those were sort of the conditions. And we've done this for a couple of years now. So what we knew is that there was going to be an economic impact. That was the whole thing. So it is about the worm in the beginning, okay? 25 liters people harvested on average per day contributes to almost 50% of monthly income, which is super depressing if you think of it like that. But for many of the people that participated, they were directly dependent on social grants within their families. So absolutely nobody employed within those programs. And I think quite nice impacts on people that are no longer considered youth. We won't maybe all put our hands up. But anybody older than 40 in South Africa, or older than 35, I think it is, are no longer considered youth. So, and there's a huge focus on the youth for youth development. So it sort of leaves out a big fraction of the population. And then also a lot of benefits going to women. So what else? I've said it's not about the worm. What about the intangible well-being benefits? And what about the impact on Kruger, which was the whole point of the study? So we spent quite a lot of time talking to Mapani worm harvesters, engaging with people, chatting, and then doing some sort of structured research, and we came up with this framework. So it was really nice to see that all those, remember there was a whole lot of different components of well-being, material and physical, psychological and emotional, social, security, freedom of choice, all of those things came out as being benefited from participating in the program. And just to sort of illustrate some of these things, I've added a few quotes here so you can try and get the vibe a little bit. But in terms of the impact, Kruger's opening up and changing in comparison to previous times. And that one feeds into this observation of creating a sense of optimism. Really important in these days where actually there's not always a lot to be optimistic about in many of these areas. So on hearing that we were selected to participate, we're happy and excited with the news. Couple more things. So it was a new place to visit. And this we found was quite interesting. So a lot of people really enjoyed seeing something being part of something for the first time. And a lot of people had never been into Kruger before, even though they live really close to the boundary of the park. We were happy. It was our first time into Kruger. We got a chance to go into the park, meet the ranger and see where he stayed. So this idea of connecting with the staff inside the park came out as quite important, which is all about building social relations and building social connections, which leads to things like social capital. And we know the benefits of social capital when we're talking about relationships. It's not just about the people, though, so about perceptions of Kruger. I was fearful before we harvested. People said there were big snakes. There was one village where a lot of the people were really, really afraid to come in, and they actually thought they weren't going to come out. Families were concerned when they were going in. And then they said they need not be afraid of the animals anymore. Having been allowed to enter the park resulted in us seeing the park differently, and it's changed how we think about the park. So these are all really important observations. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say it's not just about the worm. It is about the worm, but it's about a whole lot more. Okay, so the last one, just to highlight, I think I've mentioned those, but look at this thing about connectedness. So these sort of projects facilitate the opportunities for people to really connect to the landscape, connect to the natural heritage, connect to the people, which then has got very positive outcomes in terms of building relevance. Okay, so relevance needs connections. So we've seen the same thing with a lot of our projects. You know, we harvest thatch, hasn't happened for a couple of years, but very similar sort of outcomes. And then also we do a protein distribution project, started in 2016, also impacted on a lot of people. And we share protein that we harvest from elephant and buffalo. So buffalo is sort of routine animal offtakes, very small fraction of the buffalo that get taken off in years that it takes place. So it's a very small percentage. So it's ecologically sustainable. Elephant is more where they're individual elephants that are recurringly causing damage and danger to people. Those are then taken off. If they're able to be taken out in a safe way, then we can process the protein and use that in this project very positively, very positive outcomes. So it's not a feeding scheme. There's already feeding schemes that the government manages, but we just use those feeding schemes that are there already. There's people cooking at the schools. There's all this stuff happening, and we just, on certain days that we have meat available, we provide the protein, and we have a conversation with the kids around conservation. So just remember, these schools are maybe not like the schools that many of the people in this room attended. You know, a lot of them are very low resource schools, and I think what's important is that they don't have a lot of opportunities to engage in these sort of things. So again, it's not just about the meat. And these are some of the things that the principals from the schools mentioned to us when, after having participated. So family members came to our school, encouraged us to build relationships with the Kruger, felt that they wanted to know more about your place. The parents never thought that their children could benefit from Kruger, hoping that the relationship will grow further, and your presence signaled to the learners the importance of nature conservation. So these kind of things are really important to note, and to sort of see and to encourage as we talk about these sort of resource components. Quite similar outcomes we've seen with the traditional medicine project that we implement. You may have heard of the pepper bark project, and I don't want to show too many things on this, but because there's more to talk about. But the background to this is that there are certain rare traditional medicines that occur inside the park, and they are getting illegally harvested. So the first thing we did in true style, conservation style, is that we employed rangers to protect the plants. But we also realized that that's not going to help. Like, that's not sustainable. We've got to build relevance. We've got to make access and look at alternatives. And we started discussing with the user groups. So these are the traditional healers. There's about 3,000 traditional healers living within 20 k's of the western boundary of Kruger. Many of them using resources, and many of them buying them on the market, and many of these resources are harvested illegally. So chatting to them about our challenges, chatting about their challenges, and we came up with a sort of a solution together with the healers. So it wasn't something that we designed, but they said, well, can't we look at ways that we can propagate some of these plants? And that's what we landed up doing, by the 1,000. And this is a very popular plant, this pepperbark tree. And it's now been distributed at a very large scale in the areas around Kruger and in the rest of South Africa. So I think the important thing is that we weren't just talking about conservation. We're having discussions about the availability of species, about the use of plants and plant parts, about the acceptability of nursery propagated plants as well, because that was an issue. Well, we thought it was an issue. And then challenges that people face, because this is all about building relationships. So you have these conversations to build relationships. You don't just cruise around and drop off a whole lot of nursery plants. It's not like that at all. So these conversations, the idea is that it's ongoing. It becomes harder and harder as you expand your projects, because you've got fewer and fewer people to have more and more conversations. And if we talk about relationships, what is required to maintain a relationship? Deadly silence. What is required to maintain a relationship? So who's in a relationship? It doesn't have to be romantic. It can be with your mom or your dog or your iPhone, I suppose. But the point is that it's not a once-off engagement. You don't just have a once-off engagement. You've got to ongoing. You've got to talk. You've got to discuss. You've got to connect. And that's where relationships, people lose the plot with relationships because they think it's just a tick box, but it's definitely not a tick box. And I think with protected areas, actually across the world, that's one of the big challenges. We don't allocate enough staff to maintain relationships because it takes a lot of people to do that. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that later, but just to sort of show that, this project has been implemented at a very large scale, very nice outcomes. This is one of the first people that got a plant in 2012. You can see a little plant there. And here's hers now. So it's huge, and she's able to harvest the leaves very sustainably, more than enough for her and for the rest of the people in her village. And it's had a huge impact in terms of reducing the demands of this particular plant on the markets and the pension markets at the end of each month. So nobody buys from the markets anymore. They only use the homegrown product. So we're also expanding this to other species. I don't know if anyone knows this one. Come on, plant people. Anybody? Shirungulu. This is the wild ginger. So we've been expanding the project to the wild ginger. Just to give you an idea of scale, we distribute over around about 40,000 saplings in total, probably about 4,000 every year. How am I doing with time? Oh, come on. Okay. But I think the point here again is that it's not just about the plant. So I told you about the engagement, about the conversations that we had about deciding together about how we're going to work together to find a common solution to some of these things. And that's the principle that we've got to apply to all of the stuff that we do as we move forward. So it's not just about the plant. It's about co-developing solutions. It's about maintaining and building relationships. And interestingly, it's also not just about the traditional medicine stuff. So through this project, we've actually supported the traditional healers in a number of different ways. We help them with permitting. And then also during COVID, we helped them with PPE, like totally not a conservation-related thing, but it had an amazing impact. Nobody was supporting the traditional healers, and there's a lot of healers, and they would have been, and they are getting engaged all the time. And so just read that quote, some of the feedback that we got. So we also gave them PPE as well as information through text messages. And this is what one of the people said. So we're so happy to get the messages because it means that you remember us. So being remembered came out as one of the really positive outcomes, which I think is really important. You would have thought, like, being remembered is so important. And these are all things that build and maintain those connections. So you can't talk about resource use without talking about the controversy, and those of us that were on the WESA conference, the little webinar yesterday, which was quite fun. But this is a big thing, like I'm sure you discuss it in your lectures and things, but it's controversial. It's controversial all over the world for a number of different reasons, and they're valid reasons that lead to this controversy. One of them is ethics. People have different value systems. One of them is that we're not always sure what the ecological impact is going to be, and that's true, we don't. What is actually sustainable? One of the other challenges is that there's a whole lot of illegal resource use, so that also puts it in a bit of a bad light. And different understandings of resource use versus kind of sustainable and responsible resource use. And I think that also leads to some problems. So I've been trying to tell you how amazing all the projects are, all the resource use projects, how important they are to the sustainability of conservation and so on. But, on the other hand, not everybody sort of feels this way. And we got quite a bit of feedback on social media about some of these projects, which then meant we had to do a little bit of research. And it wasn't always positive feedback. And then, of course, people start asking questions like, is this so important? What are you actually doing out there? Look at all this. And you know how things go on social media. It can totally go viral. And you're not actually sure how important, like some people have got really big voices out there and can actually drive decision-making. So it's really important to get a little bit of a sort of a level-headed view and understanding of some of these perceptions, and that's what we try to do. So just some of the things that we were seeing in the beginning when we started. This was the Mapani worm harvesting. So is this a joke? I can't believe it. Kruger's losing focus. This was in 2010. I don't think there was Facebook. I think they used to put it on a forum website. And surely this can't be true. Like some of the people were devastated that we were doing some of this stuff because they felt that it just it just wasn't right. That wasn't what protected areas were about. So we did this research project to try and understand perceptions of visitors. So I decided to do it with the visitors. So people that are coming, those are the people that have got to say. Like, I'm not going to ask the world. Let's ask the people that are coming and visit. How do they feel about some of this stuff? So I had started off with conversations again. So not just designed a questionnaire, went out and started off with conversations with tourists. I used to hang around like a stalker at the Palabora gates and just look for someone who would talk to me. I hope there's no one here that spoke to me. I'm sorry. If there was, I apologize. But just to understand what is the vibe, what are people thinking, what are they saying, what are those sort of things, and then from there developed a couple of versions of a questionnaire, which we've now expanded on. So I reported on some of this stuff in 2019, and it was still at that stage. Okay, so now we've expanded and we've got another 1,000 or so responses. We did it on email. And I'm just going to share some of those results because I think it's really important for anyone in the conservation sector to have some of this context. So just so you understand, don't worry to read all these things, but the way we did this type of research is that it's called a Likert scale questionnaire. So you have a statement. This is a statement. And then you read the statement, and people must say if they strongly agree, if they feel neutral, if they strongly disagree, or if they just disagree. So those are the little faces there. And I always find I forget where I am with these things. So having the faces is a much easier way to kind of remind you of where you are in the process. And it also goes really quickly, actually. And people can articulate themselves as emojis quite well. So it had a total of 24 questions, and we got 1,300 and something respondents, mostly South Africans, but representing 37 different countries. Most people had visited Kruger more than once, mostly men that responded, but not that many mostly. And the interesting thing here was that I also included an option for narratives. So I'm telling you it's not about the numbers, and here I'm busy punting a number thing. So we included an option for people to be able to articulate their feelings, like, why did you put a sad face? Because people sometimes feel super emotional. It's like, I put an angry face and I want to tell you why. So then you just have a little space there that they can kind of express themselves. My husband's laughing at me. Anyway, so then we sort of were able to analyze some of those narratives so that we could then, just try and understand why some of these numbers looked like they did. So I'm going to talk a bit about those. So here's some graphs. Social scientists can do graphs. They're not great, but they all represent what I'm trying to say. So at the top, you can see I've got the statement, and then this is agree, this is disagree. So all the times you're going to see red is when people disagreed. Every time you see green is when they agreed, and neutral is in the middle. So this was the first question. And in one sample, I actually jumbled up the order of the questions as well to test whether that made a difference, okay? So allowing local communities to harvest resources from the park is a threat. Most people agreed with that. It's definitely a threat. But then look what happened here. It was quite interesting. Allowing people to derive benefits from the park, such as harvesting of mopani, is important for the sustainability. And you can see it kind of evened out a little bit. So actually, when you put it that way, then you get people sort of thinking, yeah, maybe you're right, maybe you're right. So it's really important how you tell these stories. Okay, and then some of the qualitative stuff helped me to sort of understand that a bit more. So then people said, well, it depends how it's managed, it must be sustainable, and it must be discrete. And that can certainly influence how people answer some of the stuff. So I'm going to fly through some of these. Some of these are less interesting maybe for this forum, but some of them might be interesting. So having access to information about the scale was important for people. So that's the left hand. So most people agreed, if we just know that it's a tiny scale, you're only taking off a few worms, you're going to just cull a couple of buffalo, it's not going to affect, then they feel okay. But if you just say we're going to cull and we're going to feed kids at the schools, that's not a good way to tell the story. And then knowing that the park monitors the process also makes people feel more comfortable. So you've got it under control, you're monitoring. So we've got to make sure when we're telling the stories that we're including this kind of stuff in the narrative, because it helps people to feel more comfortable. But the monitoring thing was important, and now you can't see here, but one of the people said it's not only about the monitoring, it's about control and about authorized persons, which then meant to us it's because they don't trust us. So, it's not just, you can say you're monitoring, but how do we know you're actually monitoring? And that's really important. So we've got to build that, we've got to look at that. And that's going to influence how the public sees some of the stuff. So we've got to get credibility and make sure we keep it. This was just interesting. I think the important thing here is that people feel just as comfortable with the harvesting of mopani worms and vegetation as they do about large game. That was quite a surprise, because I thought, big and hairies were going to be a bit more emotional, but not the actual hairies being emotional, but people being emotional about the hairies. But that's not actually what we saw, which was really interesting. And some people are very, very opinionated about the elephant debate. So Sam, it's really nice that Sam's here, because you thought that you have to count elephants to know if there's too many, but you don't. You just have to ask the public. I'll tell you now if there's too many. So this was another one. So I would prefer not to see the harvesting of resources taking place. Yeah, sure, no problem. Most people agreed with that. No problem. We can do that. And then this one was just a sort of a negative. We asked the questions in a number of different ways. So if animals are killed, the carcasses must not be used for human consumption. No problem. People disagreed with that, which means that they're comfortable with us using, animal carcasses for human consumption. We'll leave that for now. Oh, this was quite interesting. So this was a statement about kind of value systems, I suppose. So the Kruger Park is a natural environment that's natural because there's no people and little human impact. Yeah, that was the first. Yes, people felt definitely that. But then we asked it slightly differently. So for thousands of years, people lived in the natural landscape and played an important role in maintaining ecosystems. And then suddenly they weren't so sure, because then you can see how it kind of flattens off there, which is also interesting. It's really useful to kind of know how to start dealing with some of these narratives. Okay, so we maybe just read that one on the left. There's so little of this left in the world. So this was one of the red ones. The Kruger is a jewel in the crown of African game parks and shouldn't be treated like a farm to be denuded. You know, so we've got to make sure when we're telling our stories that we're not telling that story, of course. Okay, so this was about live and lethal offtakes. So it's okay to sell live animals to generate revenue, yes. It's not okay to lethally harvest animals to generate revenue. So there's not a sort of a comfortableness with using these sort of things to generate revenue, which was quite useful. So here we go, this is for Sam. There's no need to control game numbers in Kruger. The animals should be left alone. The area is large enough. So most people disagreed. It wasn't huge though, like the difference, but most people disagreed with that. There's too many elephants in Kruger and they're causing negative impacts. There are, look, there's too many elephants, you can see there. Most of the public said that there are too many elephants, but it really wasn't a big difference. I thought that was quite interesting, but what's different about this one is how many neutrals there are. It's the only one where there's like this huge big whack of neutrals in the middle, and it's because it's a very difficult question. And it's actually quite impressive that there's so many neutrals, because I think there's actually a lot of neutrals among us as well, and it's because it's not an easy question to answer. Okay. So I think the point here is we sort of looked at a positivity index. So how positive are people about some of this stuff? Interestingly, the face-to-face questionnaires gave us the most positive answers. And I don't know, you know, there's different reasons, there might be different reasons for that. But interviewing people face-to-face gave a much more positive perspective on things. It might be because they're too afraid. I mean, I don't think I'm that scary, but too afraid to say they were against it. But I also think it's got to do with this thing. And this is a paper that came out in Nature. So the title is, You Can't Fight Feelings with Facts, You've Got to Start with a Chat. And I think just by having these conversations about some of the stuff goes a long way to building those connections and then giving you a bit of credibility to have the ongoing conversation. And I think, you know, we heard that yesterday with the Wester thing, and very good advice coming out there that we've got to have these conversations. We've got to build the connection so we can have the conversations about this resource use stuff. And if people aren't interested in even having the conversation, then I think that's, you know, that sort of says something as well. Okay. Luckily you can't see this because I'm just going to skip this section. And I think I'm just going to acknowledge that, you know, there was probably in the region of about 10% of people that were negative about this. So sort of right through all the questions, there was about 10%. And these are some of the things that they said. No, not even if I have the information. I like this place to be wild. So for these people, this kind of stuff meant it was threatening their perception of wildness. There's people everywhere. I like it when there's no people. And I'm afraid of these questions. I visit here because of the pureness, and this sort of stuff detracts from the pureness. So I'd like raises questions around wilderness and who's the wilderness actually for. And I think just to sort of end off the section on resource use, just to highlight that, you know, all of humanity uses resources, but it's about all of us. Doesn't matter what we eat, or you know, we all use resources. We're all wearing clothes. We've got cell phones. All, you know, but it's about how you use them. That's really important. That's the debate that we should be having: is how do we use resources, not whether we do or whether we don't. Okay. So what about jobs? And we'll go through this example a little bit more quickly. But I think the point is that I've shown that there's a huge need for jobs in the environmental sector. Obviously, that's a big component of employment within the Lowveld. A lot of unemployment. All 7 of our municipalities have got unemployment rates higher than the national average. And there's a lot of people working in conservation. So there's about 14,000 people that are employed just directly within the Greater Kruger. So how are they feeling about conservation? How are those staff feeling about conservation? How is being employed impacting on the well-being? So these are some of the questions that we were interested in understanding. And we did this through a case study using the Environmental Monitor Program. So some of you may have heard of it before. The Environmental Monitor Program is a national program aiming to address poverty relief, but also with an environmental component to it. I work specifically in this landscape, and we partnered with the Kruger to Canyon Biosphere. They have a number of environmental monitors implementing this program in a way like no one else, I think, because of their very strong focus on learning and capacity building. And that has had a huge impact on how their staff are impacted themselves in terms of their well-being. So our aim was to use them as a case study to look at well-being in the conservation sector, but then we wanted to do it with the people that were actually that we're working with. So all of the EMs were actually involved in designing the research and in implementing the research. And we did that in a number of different ways. So just to give you an idea of the geographical scope of people that were part of the program, you can see it over there, a number of different reserves where the EMs are employed. And we came up with another framework. So this is another well-being framework, similar to the Mopani worm one. But the point being that you've got all these different components. So it's not just about the cash. You're not just reporting on the cash that people are getting, but you're reporting on all these other things as well. So I'm going to just flash through a couple of the quotes that you might find interesting, just to sort of illustrate how we get to this sort of framework. So being employed helps us a lot because we've got a house to sleep in. These were some of the material things. I'm currently renovating my parents' house and building a room for myself. This has got a positive impact on me and my family. I no longer share with my mum. I feel happy and beautiful. I'm no longer depressed. So these are the things that came out on the psychological component as a result of these jobs, you know. So when people talk about the Expanded Public Works program and, you know, people are very critical about it, I just think, flip, you know, it's changed people's lives in a lot of instances. I feel confident and respected. My opinion is considered. And all of these things came out as a result of being employed. I'm not sure how representative, Shame, it's like super jumpy. But I'm not sure how representative this is of the entire EM program, but certainly within the K2C because of their focus on learning. Okay, so then there was one on knowledge and learning. I get to do what I love, I improve my knowledge, and I help people. The part that I like least about my job is doing the same thing over and over again. I mean, I can say that for myself too. I like doing different things that challenges my mind. You know, these are the things that are making people like their jobs, and liking your job is really important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that just now, especially in the conservation sector. Social well-being. My family are happy because I'm working and I'm able to take care of them. So being able to help your family and build social connections within your family as well as with the community that you live in. It gives me great fulfillment that I can help my family. My siblings see me as a role model. People respect us and we no longer go and ask our neighbors for help. So you can see there's a kind of a community link there as well. Okay, so then of course there's also costs associated with this, and we recorded some of the costs as well. Things like I used to babysit my siblings, there's no one to babysit. I don't have time to assist my mom in the garden with our crops and so on. So these things are also really important. So you've got to be able to look at these costs and benefits as well. So now you can't see my next cool graph, unfortunately, but it's a graph that shows well-being, the different dimensions of well-being, and including the costs and benefits of well-being. There we go. And I think the point there is that, you know, at a glance, when you use this framework, you're able to see net impact. So you're able to see, so everything above the line is positive, everything below the line we would call a cost. So you can say, okay, at a glance, it looks like there's a net benefit from this program on a number of different components of well-being. So that was quite a cool thing to look at. And the other thing to note is that those are all psychological. All of those things that I've just included in that block there are psychological elements of human well-being. Okay, so a word on learning. Learning new things promotes greater satisfaction and optimism. It boosts self-confidence and can help build a sense of purpose and contribute positively to mental well-being. Okay, workplace well-being is really important. So why this comes down to the conservation sector is because it's, firstly, okay. So firstly, it's important because people flourish in an environment where they're happy. It influences performance. You know, so I don't know how many of us can say that we work in an environment where our bosses manage us in a way that we flourish. You know, because working makes us happy. You know, there's not a lot of us, but there's ways to manage people that you can get some of these outcomes. And the other interesting thing is that it leads to something called, this is super nerdy, this term, but it's called organizational citizenship behavior. So if you think about what that means, it means that you support your organization regardless of, you know, of what you're actually employed to do. So while this is important for conservation, and certainly within you know, the illegal wildlife trade and more people, you know, losing trust and becoming involved in this kind of stuff, is that, you know, we want to keep our staff happy. We want to keep them making the right decisions. And that's where some of this stuff leads to, okay? It's too much text, we don't have to worry too much, but I think the point is that we've got, at the bottom there, look at that graph, there's 260, somewhere in the region, 267 hometowns and villages represented on the Kruger staff at the moment. Okay, there's 27 Kruger staff that are employed to engage with the communities officially as their job. We've got about 3,000 staff that are living and working in these villages. So if we manage our staff in a way that leads to organizational citizenship behavior, your impact on the ground is huge. People are all living in these areas that we are, paying people to work in. So there's huge potential. And we actually saw with the EM program that having been employed, people speak about conservation a lot more since they got their jobs. Okay, so let's skip some of this stuff. I think the important thing with this one is that, you can use that trade-off between costs and benefits to put things in perspective. So human-wildlife conflict, it's often seen as a huge negative impact, but if you put it in perspective, and we asked people for another project, what is the most challenging aspect of village life in this area? And they actually spoke about access to roads and access to transport and access to services. Human-wildlife conflict came in right down below. But if you went in there up front and you said, oh, how bad is human-wildlife conflict in this area, you'd get like 90% of the people saying, super bad. So that's why it's important to put some of these things in context. So the last little thing that I'm going to do with my 1.5 minutes is to talk about research and 2 minutes. We're fine. Is to talk about research and see how does research actually make a difference. So does the stuff that we're doing make a difference? Do you think it does? Who thinks it does? Just to wake everyone up. I see there's lots of yawns. Do you think it makes a difference? Okay, so let's see if we think it makes a difference. So we know that conservation science is expanding. There's tons of papers. I mean, everyone's reviewing papers, writing papers. There's loads of papers coming out. There's lots of new disciplines coming out. So it seems like we should be winning, But are we actually winning? So this is a framework that I took from a paper that was shared by a colleague of mine, and they looked at the past and future role of conservation science in saving biodiversity. And they've got this framework that I'm not going to talk you through it, but I think the point is that they've sort of divided all conservation science into research that looks understanding patterns, process drivers, and threats, or research that looks at responses. And their sort of presumption is that you need both. You need research that's going to unpack and understand the drivers and stuff, but that can't be all you're doing. You've got to be doing stuff that's looking at some of these responses as well. Okay, so then they sort of subdivided those into some other little categories which are not as important. But what they found, they reviewed nearly 1,000 papers, okay? And they found that most of the papers, this is global, most of the papers are actually looking at address just the sort of the top stuff, the threats and the understanding the mechanisms, understanding the drivers. And very few actually include some sort of proposed response to the threat, and very few design and implement some changes to solve the problem. And I thought, no man, this can't be true. We do such cool stuff in South Africa. This is like a global study. Definitely we're going to have some nice applied stuff. But what they did try and explain is that the reason for this is that you can look in that block there. So the reason for this is that, understanding the state of nature is what ecologists do. If you love the environment, you study ecology stuff. So that's what we do, that's what we train to do. But that's not all that we can do. But all these drivers and things are social. So if you look at all those things there, those are all the social stuff. And that's what's quite interesting. So we're not doing enough on that. SAWMA. So I took the abstracts from 3 different years, so 2000, 2010, 2019, and I allocated whether they were threats or response research. Of course, they might be different in person. If anyone's like me and you write an abstract like 4 months before you talk, it's not normally the same thing that you talk about. But I had to do it based on the abstracts. And then I also allocated social ecological. I'm nearly done. Just to see, because I was like, well, are we doing better in the social sciences? So that's just some examples of how I allocated them. But the interesting thing was 40% of the SAWMA presentations focused on responses, which was amazing. I thought that was brilliant. So, 60% on understanding drivers and threats, 40% on the responses, which was much more than in the global study, which I thought was pretty cool. This is just some of the sub-things, which is not that interesting, but the number of papers in SAWMA that are proposing things has declined, but the number of papers that are testing things has gone up. So well done. We're testing stuff. What about the social? This is the awesome part. about 20% of papers are social, and that hasn't changed over time. Isn't that interesting? So look, those 3 years, 19, 20, 19, how I define social I can tell you about later, okay? But it's around about 20%. What's interesting is that most of the majority of the social papers address responses to threats, which is a lot higher fraction than the sort of ecological type of papers, which I thought was interesting. And I think there's obvious reasons for it, is because the threats are social. You know, so there's sort of reasons why that looks like it is. But I think the point there is that it's not just about the numbers. There's a lot more social science going on. There's a lot more types of social science going on. Is it good enough? I don't know. Is research even the solution? And I'm going to finish off with this quote. I think what we've got to realize is that if conservation biology, all the stuff that we're doing, conservation science, conservation social science, everything, becomes isolated in the mental world of academia, it'll be of little use, and its prescriptions will not be informed by the real-world problems of the people that are most involved and affected. So we've got to do stuff that makes a difference. We can't only, but we have to be doing some of this good stuff. So this session is looking awesome so far. Much more people looking at responses versus threats based on the title. That's all I had. And one unknown red sort of herring there, we're not really sure. I couldn't really allocate that. Obviously can't divulge the person talking about that unknown one, but I'm sure we'll learn in the next session more about that talk. So I hope that we're excited for the session on social stuff, because I think it makes a difference. It's not all that makes a difference, but it certainly does make a difference. Okay.
Very well done on dealing with the technical issues. Our next speaker in the session, we're going to move on, is Jeanette Fouchier, and she is going to be telling us about the relationship between researchers and game farmers in South Africa. Jeanette, thank you very much.
Okay, morning everybody. I'm going to try and not wreck your brains this morning with a heavy stats talk. Rather, I'm going to do a light research or a light relationship talk. Not the Facebook status kind, but the relationship between us and landowners. Somewhere in our conservation career, we have all worked with landowners. And somewhere along the line, we're probably still going to work with landowners. So it's probably a good idea to see how we can improve these relationships. So the relationships between humans and the natural environment has long been the topic of discussion amongst researchers, but the significance of human-human relationships has often been overlooked. In 2017, the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform stated that about 80% of the land in the country is in privately owned hands. And these privately owned properties have responded to land use changes, both in agricultural and in the game ranching sectors. Now, this increase and sometimes decrease in wildlife-based production has led to a change in landscape of nature conservation in South Africa. And with the conversion of livestock farms to game farms, it means there's been an introduction of different wildlife species into certain areas. And this has all resulted in conservationists having to look outside of protected areas to do their work and to involve private landowners. In South Africa, and here at this conference, we know we've got many different kinds of researchers. And you're either a local researcher or an international researcher, but regardless of where you're from or what your speciality is, somewhere along the lines you are probably going to work with landowners. And this creates the opportunity for knowledge co-production, co-management, and the improved relationships. And when this relationship can be approached and handled correctly, we know it can benefit us and our projects. So also, in a South African context, we all know that farms are generally handed down from one generation to the next. And as with that is the management plan of that farm. Often farmers doing something because their dads did that and their dads did that. You know, that kind of mindset. But this often leads to conflict of interest when researchers approach a certain management objectives with a scientific point of view instead of a livelihood point of view, as most farmers do. This is also confirmed by or mentioned by Odhiambo, who states that each party wants to pursue its own interests, and in so doing ends up contradicting or compromising the interest of others. So in short, Conflict of interest results in unstable relationships, and this could be a limiting factor when we want to do our field work on privately owned properties. But this conflict shouldn't be seen as a limiting factor, but should rather be seen as an opportunity for constructive change and growth. And by engaging the landowners, in the conservation prioritization process, the success of conservation plans will improve. And this engagement with landowners could therefore lead to knowledge co-production. So when various parties work closely together to produce knowledge, it is more likely that they will regard this knowledge as legitimate and also use this own knowledge in their own management plans. So our big question that we want to ask here is, what is the current relationship status between farmers or between landowners and researchers, and how can this be improved and maintained? We hope that the study can actually provide us with some information into how we can improve future relationships and how we can increase co-management and knowledge co-production opportunities. We'd also like to minimize potential human-human conflict. So obviously, if you haven't gathered by now, it's a qualitative data study, and we use structured questionnaires. Unfortunately, our drawback was that the questionnaires were sent out via email or hand-delivered where possible. The data collection took place over a 2-month period, and the prime location was in the Limpopo province. The questionnaire also consisted of 4 different sections, just to briefly explain to you, but personal details, we just wanted to know where the properties were located, what was the first languages of the property owner, and what was the primary and secondary function of the property. The second section gave us insight regarding the respondents' past research experience, so basically, have they had researchers on their property before? Did they get information before the project started, during the project, and at the end of the project? Then we also wanted to know what was the preferred format in which information could be conveyed to the landowner. The relationship status section enabled us to understand how landowners felt towards the researchers, and they were supposed to rate the relationship on a scale. Now, I have to emphasize it here that we did ask the participants to rate researchers as a whole and not one specific person or one specific organization. They were also asked whether the researchers spoke the same language or were from the same perceived cultural background, and if this would have affected the relationship. We also wanted to know, lastly, whether they would allow researchers back onto their properties again and if they would encourage others to do the same. And then the final section allowed the participant to provide suggestions on how the relationship between landowners and researchers could be improved and what they expect to receive from researchers in the future. So just quickly, the results, 90% of the participants were from Limpopo, and also 65% of them were Afrikaans speaking. The primary and secondary function of the properties were mostly game farming, and it was always in combination with either agriculture or tourism. Now, 75% of the respondents had researchers on their properties before, but only 80% of these received information at the start of the project. But they also all had different perspectives regarding the amount of information received, with 6% saying that they were not informed at all, and fortunately, the majority said that they did receive detailed information. We asked them whether they were kept up to date during the project, and majority of them said that they were kept up to date during the project. However, 13% also said that they were not kept up to date at all. But good news is, most of them said that they did not want information, so they all want to be part of the project, and they all want to know what it is that we're doing on their properties. The respondents were also asked if they received any information when the project ended, and 13% said they didn't receive any information, but 27% fortunately said that they were well informed. We asked them to describe the relationship. 7% of them said that they had a good relationship, and it was excellent and continued well after the project ended. Majority of them said they had also a good relationship, but they only exchanged pleasantries whenever they happened to see each other. And unfortunately, a few of them said that they did not have a relationship with the respondents at all. When we asked them why they thought the relationship was of such a nature, it's because they said they felt judged. Some of them felt judged by the researchers, but the majority of them said that they felt the researchers were open and honest towards the landowners. We wanted to know whether they spoke the same language or was from the same cultural background. 47% spoke the same language. 33% said they were from the same perceived cultural background, and only 20% said that they thought it would make a difference. The good news is, however, they would allow all of you back on their properties again, and they would also encourage their neighbors to allow you on their properties again. In regards to future relationship, we asked them what is the preferred method for feedback, and they said digital update. But a large amount of them also said that a combination of reading material and verbal updates would be best. So don't just have a braai at the end of your project, have a braai and give them something to take home to read. We gave them the opportunity to give comments and suggestions, and it was very clear from this that the lack of information received was a concern, with some of them saying that we only received information after we asked for it, and we would have liked more interaction so that we can be informed of the purpose of the studies. There was a few other comments which I thought was worth mentioning. They mentioned that they said, or that they wanted more information, or the information be given to them, such as camera traps, with one specific participant stating that researchers should ensure that a specific site where work was conducted is cleaned once the project is ended. So some of you guys have been cleaning up after yourselves. So from this, it is clear that there's sufficient literature regarding co-management and knowledge co-production, but there's little literature regarding the shortcomings of a relationship in this context. And stable relationships which lead to co-management success stories are evident across the globe, and community involvement is encouraged, with researchers saying local communities should work with researchers to produce new knowledge. Fortunately, efforts of public members interacting with scientists to participate in the field of scientific research is increasing. And this type of scientific research can be enhanced by developing a higher quality relationship, or just a relationship at all. So with landscape changes on increase and a need for conservation efforts to move outside of protected areas, we can just assume that in the future, such relationships are going to become more important for ourselves. So in conclusion, to improve and maintain the stability and trustworthiness of relationship, we need to identify what the shortcomings are. In this case, the shortcomings are the lack of feedback provided to the landowners from the researchers. So we therefore highly recommend that more effort should be done to not only communicate often and informatively with the landowners, but also to provide landowners with results of your project in a format which meets their needs.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. We've got, I think, 2 minutes for questions. If there's anybody in the audience, you can jump up. But my question to you, Jeanette, is how do you think the best way, what is the best way to deal with that judgment issue? How do you get around that? What do you have to do?
I would say communication. Nothing's ever going to happen if you don't communicate open and honestly with either the landowner you're working with or them with you in return as well. It isn't a one-way street, to be fair. Some of the farmers are really sometimes difficult to deal with. But I would say the best way to handle is just to communicate, and open and honestly, in a format which meets their needs.
Super. What's our time like there, ladies and gents? 1 minute. So we do have a chance for another question if there are any. Doesn't look like it. Jeanette, thank you very much. All right, folks. We are moving on to our next presentation, which is a virtual presentation. So Jacques will bring it up for us in a moment. It's by Paul Kazaba, and it will be on ethnozoology. Thanks very much, Jacques.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to attend this anniversary conference, even remotely, the conference of the Southern African Wildlife Management Association, and this plenary one about people and conservation. I'm here to present the results of research work about ethnozoological uses and local people's perceptions of a competitor primate in the fringe of a protected area in Democratic Republic of Congo. I am sorry, my English is highly influenced by my French background, but I will do my best to make my message clear enough to be well understood by the audience. Here are the few elements I'm going to present. I will start with an introduction and and with conclusion and conservation implications of the results of this research work. And the work was about human-primate interactions in general, and we have selected the Kinda baboon as the model primate species of interest. And the work was conducted in Kundelungu National Park, which is part of the Protected Areas Network of Democratic Republic of Congo. The background of this study: why did we study human-primate interactions? It is because there is an increase in space and resource overlap between humans and wildlife, and in particular ways, non-human primates, who we will be referring to as primates in the following parts of this presentation. The other reason is that there are many challenges at the human-primate interface, and the last and not the least reason is that human-primate competition is a new and very interesting frontier in for primatology. Now, why did we select the Kinda baboon as the primate model species for this study? It is because of the wide. In general, baboons have a broad ecological niche, which indicates a high level of probability to widely overlap in terms of resource utilizations and space utilizations with humans, which is a very interesting factor for addressing human-primate competition in relatively more acute extents. The other reasons for the selection of Kinda baboon is that because this is among the least studied baboon species. Another element, the last element of the background, is that in Kundelungu National Park and vicinities, two previous studies we have conducted have suggested that there's a notable level of human dependence on baboon edible fruit trees. This is the first. And the second study, that there is a negative impact of human activities on diversity and abundance of baboon edible trees, which suggested human baboon competition for wild fruit trees. But these studies were not sufficient to better characterize such a competition. That's why there was still need to know whether baboons are perceived as competitors by local people, competitors for wild fruit trees. Therefore, the objective of this study was to determine the link between park adjacent dwellers' attitudes towards baboons and perception of co-used resources. Here, a quick presentation of the study site. The study was conducted in the southeastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo in Kundelungu National Park here. The park has two zones, the annex zone and the integral zone in this side. We have conducted the research in two villages, the two Lukafu and Mulenga. And I should stress that Kundelungu National Park is one of the typical human encroached protected area in southeastern part of Democratic Republic. So in Democratic Republic of Congo, if you consider the general protected parks and reserves network of the country. We have conducted ethnozoological surveys in the two villages, which are among the main human settlements in the vicinities of the park. And we have performed some chi-square tests of association on the set of data collected in order to obtain the few results we are going to present. Here now is the part of results. We have two different sides. The first is about zoological uses of baboons, and the second wing of results is about the perceptions of local communities on these baboons and the resources they share with humans. We should note that the main result regarding ethnozoological uses is that baboons are more used as sources of bush meat, and even though at some in some locations in the city, in these villages, they are considered as pets as they are used. And for those who use the body parts of baboons, it is mainly the flesh that is consumed the most as the source of as bushmeat. Now, regarding local people's attitude towards baboons and co-used resources, we should say that baboons are mainly perceived as crop raiders, as we see here the large proportion of people who have mentioned these species as crop raiders. This is the main negative impact on these animals, and they are also considered as aggressive animals, but by a few part of the population, so a part of the respondents we dealt with. It is important to mention that there are two core results in this side of the work. Is that we have noted that it is not the recognition of baboon vulnerability by local people, but the frequency of human baboon encounters in the wild that was associated with park adjacent dwellers' propensity to conservation, as it was shown by the results of the chi-square test. Another core result of this study is that pro-conservation views were weakly expressed among the respondents who observed decreasing tendencies in indigenous trees, most of which are co-used with baboons, as also shown by this result of the test. So in conclusion, we say that baboons are actually perceived as competitors for wildfire trees in the vicinities of Kunalungu National Park. Here are a few conservation and research implications from this research, which are applicable to similar contexts. Is that there's need for alleviation of human-baboon conflicts through activities such as growing of human-valued and baboon edible trees in farms or homestead gardens. Effective ban of illegal human settlements and activities in protected areas is also important. Another set of activities can intend to promote friendly access and community support to protected areas and wildlife. And when promoting community support to wildlife and protected areas, we should not merely highlight the vulnerability of wild animal, rather the contribution of wildlife to ecological processes and sustainable human development should be also showcased. Conservation cannot be done properly without research. And here, I think there is need for more research about the Kinda baboons, which is among the least studied primates. But not only the species, but also other baboons, primates, and wildlife in general. But also given this increase in opportunities of contact between human populations and wildlife, it is very important to increase research of these human wildlife interactions. And there is also a necessity for collaborative research, to collaborate through Southern Africa, research about different cases. This study was about baboons, for example. Other studies about other species in the ways they use the forest resources or other resources of the environment. It would be highly interesting to guide conservation actions at the interface between humans and wildlife. I thank you very much for your attention to this presentation, and welcome the different few questions that may arise from my speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask Paul or any of the other virtual presenters a question, please go onto sawmalive.co.za and type it into the chat on the side of the YouTube channel there for Paul, and he will respond to that. Folks, we've got a few minutes before the start of our next presentation. Because we are streaming live, we do need to stick to our time as much as possible, as closely as possible. So if anybody has a question for Louise or Jeanette might not be there, she's just over there, you are welcome to stand up and ask your question. Louise has very kindly agreed to answer any questions if you have them. If not, we will go into stony silence for a few minutes. If you do, just jump up to the microphone and you can ask it. If not, you can go back to your emails for 5 minutes. All right. Thank you. I will call up our next speaker in about 2 minutes, Michael. All right. All right, folks, we're moving on to our next speaker. Michael is going to be telling us how green a golf course is. Michael Ross, thank you very much.
How green is a golf course? For some of you, that might seem a rather obvious question, and you might be inclined to switch off immediately and ignore the rest of what I have to say. Because if you look at this picture, you can clearly see the golf course looks relatively green. But before you switch off entirely and don't listen to anything else I have to say, if I rephrase it as how biologically important is the wildlife that lives on there, and why does that even matter, you might not necessarily immediately know the answer, and you might be a bit more inclined to listen. But first, before I get into that, some background. The human population is increasing, and it's increasing exponentially, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, which happened in around 1790, and it now sits at over 7 billion. Associated with that, the human footprint has expanded across much of the globe, and we now cover almost all of the available land. These two things have resulted in serious environmental degradation. As the number of people increases and as our need for space increases, we are also encroaching on wild lands and losing species at an almost unprecedented rate. We are living in what is now called the sixth extinction. This is potentially one of the starkest pictures I've come across because it shows how not only are we eating away at our natural resources, but we're also eating away at ourselves in the process. An increasing human population expanding across the world invariably pushes wild animals into smaller and smaller places and brings wild animals into close contact with humans. Sometimes, as a result of this, human-wildlife conflicts occur. So, for instance, leopards might come into close contact with humans and threaten their lives or eat their livestock. Elephants can bash down fences and destroy property, and other wild creatures are moving into human and urban spaces. These conflicts are likely to only increase in the future as the human population looks set to continue expanding. We therefore wanted to know to what extent is coexistence possible? Can one solution for an increasing human population and these small and smaller wildlife preserves be that humans and wildlife can coexist together? In order to answer this question, we studied an environmentally friendly golf course 25 kilometers north of Cape Town on South Africa's west coast. This estate, Atlantic Beach Estate shown in red, is surrounded by Blaauwberg Nature Reserve, a nature reserve. Atlantic Beach Estate appears to be the ideal place where humans and wildlife coexist. It's painted as this picture of tranquility where humans and wildlife live in harmony. As you can see, there's residential housing, a golf course, and these large tracts of natural land where wildlife is supposedly able to persist. Invariably, however, things aren't quite that simple. So as you can see here, this is the estate. It was originally cleaved out from Blaauwberg Nature Reserve in the early 2000s. That's the land you can see to the south, some bits towards the west, and to the east. The estate was given permission to be constructed on the premise that it would be an eco-friendly estate and that wildlife would be able to persist within the estate, but also move from the south up to the north as a sort of corridor for wildlife movement. However, as you can see, the estate is dominated by human settlement, and the remaining land is taken up by a golf course and small patches of natural land. I want to see whether the results from this study could help inform city planners and potentially decide whether eco-estates might be a viable way to conserve both wildlife and humans. In order to do this, I looked at 3 different taxa, which I'll get some more into now. I sampled on the estate, which is that top cluster of points, and in Blaauwberg Nature Reserve, the bottom cluster of points. Blaauwberg Nature Reserve would act as the control. So essentially, what land on the estate would look like if the estate hadn't been built. And as a result, I located those points as far away from human settlement as possible. In terms of small mammal trapping, I had 6 trap lines on Atlantic Beach Estate and 6 on Blaauwberg Nature Reserve, and this resulted in a total of 3,600 trap nights. There were a number of shared species that occurred between Atlantic Beach Estate, the circle in red, and Blaauwberg Nature Reserve in blue. Importantly, those that were found on only one estate, or on one site, on Atlantic Beach Estate were those associated with humans, such as the house rat, or those that are found in disturbed habitats, whereas those that were found in Blaauwberg Nature Reserve are habitat specialists. There are also various other ways that you can quantify the diversity and evenness, and while these numbers themselves aren't important, it's important to look at the general trend, where Atlantic Beach Estate, in general, had a higher evenness and diversity than Blaauwberg Nature Reserve. You can also look at how the trap lines themselves were separated from one another, and you can see here that trap lines on Atlantic Beach Estate generally clustered together, and trap lines on Blaauwberg Nature Reserve clustered together, suggesting that there are 2 distinct communities. One of the interesting things I came across was this white-tailed mouse or rat, which is understudied and persists in quite small numbers and is also a threatened species. And this was found only on the nature reserve, as you saw earlier, and not on the estate. In terms of medium and large mammal sampling, I used a camera trap grid across Atlantic Beach Estate and across Blauberg Nature Reserve. I had 25 camera traps set up in each of those two sites and approximately 1,500 trap nights. These are the number of independent captures from across Atlantic Beach Estate. Those in red are human or human species. Green are introduced, blue are native, and as you can see, Atlantic Beach Estate primarily had either humans and vehicles or introduced species, such as the domestic cat, whereas it was missing a number of native species, such as steenbok, honey badger, common duiker, and caracal. Blauberg, on the other hand, was dominated primarily by native species and was missing a number of human-introduced species, such as the domestic cat. Perhaps most disconcerting was the high prevalence of domestic cats located ubiquitously across the estate. And another interesting animal we came across was the African striped weasel, which I didn't even know existed, but happens to live on both Atlantic Beach Estate and Blauberg Nature Reserve and hasn't been seen in the city of Cape Town since 2013. In terms of bird sampling, I again had a mirrored approach where I sampled an Atlantic Beach Estate and Blauberg Nature Reserve at 40 stations with 3 visits to each station, using voice callbacks and visual observations. And similarly, again here, the numbers aren't necessarily important, except that Atlantic Beach Estate had a higher species richness and was generally more even and more diverse across a range of metrics. Once again, sites on Atlantic Beach Estate, seen here in red, clustered together, and sites on Blauberg Nature Reserve, in blue, clustered together. Interestingly, these two sites, which were on Atlantic Beach Estate, clustered with Blauberg Nature Reserve because they were on the edge of the estate, suggesting that birds don't necessarily penetrate deep into their estate. We also wanted to look at functional diversity, and it appeared that Atlantic Beach Estate was more functionally diverse than Blauberg Nature Reserve, but both these sites had a similar distribution of functional diversity when compared against one another and when compared to Southern Africa generally. So what does this all mean? Well, Atlantic Beach Estate was all right for small mammals, considering it had a number of shared species, but it also had a number of introduced species and was missing the habitat specialists. In terms of large mammals, it didn't perform well for large mammals, considering the large number of human-introduced species and the fact that it was missing a number of species that were present on the nature reserve. Lastly, in terms of birds, Atlantic Beach Estate seemed to perform really well for birds. It maintained almost all the species found on the nature reserve and a number of species associated with water. This begs the question, how could you return the eco to the eco estate? One of the major concerns on the estate is the high prevalence of domestic cats, which consume vast quantities of small mammals and birds, approximately 27 million in Cape Town alone. In line with this, you could also reduce the number of other human-associated species, such as dogs, and introduced species, such as the springbok. One could also consider increasing the number of patches and patch connectivity, as well as naturalizing the golf course by reducing the playing area. I also wanted to think about eco-states generally, and more broadly, what principles could be applied when thinking about constructing an eco-state. And 3 important questions that come from this research are there endangered species present or habitat specialists, because these might not necessarily persist on an estate? Secondly, are there large mammals in the area, and particularly if these large mammals are dangerous, that is sometimes at odds with human needs and maybe isn't a good place for an eco-estate? And finally, is the land natural or transformed? As seen in this case, if it's natural, it might decrease the species richness of some taxa. However, there's some evidence that in transformed land, particularly urban areas or ex-agricultural land, eco-states might actually bolster species richness. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. There is some time for questions, if we've got any from the floor. Everybody's frightened to get up and stand by the microphone. So, Michael, what are your thoughts on rewilding these sorts of estates with like large predators or larger predators and things like that? Do you think rewilding is a good idea?
So, at least in this, I'll speak to this particular context. One of the conclusions or main conclusions from this thing is it seems like the fence between the nature reserve and the estate, which is supposed to be impermeable, is actually permeable. And that might well be in the best interests of animals that live in the nature reserve, because the high prevalence of domestic cats and other human-associated animals might be more detrimental to the animals living in the nature reserve than those that are currently living in the estate. So as it currently stands, I definitely wouldn't suggest rewilding the estate, particularly, without changing some other things such as the prevalence of domestic cats or people's perceptions of nature in the estate. And so certainly wouldn't support introducing a huge number of large mammals into the area.
Indeed, a leading question there. Anything else from the floor? Just jump up over there. Thanks.
Hello, Michael.
Hi.
Hello, Michael. My question is simply this. In a situation that I know in the Western Cape, at Pringle Bay, there was a tremendous preponderance of domestic cats. And then a caracal got into the area and flattened the domestic cat population. So is that possibly an exception to your rule of not rewilding?
So the domestic cat and caracal debate is actually really interesting for this estate because they have had caracal intrusions onto the estate. Unfortunately, however, people were extremely upset with the caracal coming onto the estate, eating their fur children. And there was a big outcry as a result of that. They approached the city of Cape Town in an attempt to remove the caracal because it ate, someone suggested, upwards of 70 domestic cats on the estate. And so at the moment, it seems like there isn't a caracal on the estate, and as things currently stand and people's perceptions of wildlife and with cats roaming free, I think it's probably best it remains that way.
Thank you, Michael. Folks, now we're going to move into a bit of a run of virtual presentations. So please remember, if you're here in the audience, to get onto the SAWMA Live site and type your questions and comments into those presentation comment sections so that the presenters who are not here in person can answer you. So our next presentation is by Chloe. And Chloe is going to be telling us about the sustainable livelihoods or about sustainable livelihoods around Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe. Thanks very much, Jacques.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my talk remotely. This will allow to save a bit of carbon. Today, I'm going to reflect on the perceived drivers of local livelihoods and potential leverage in Casa Transfrontier Conservation Area. So we are well aware of the global decline of life on Earth as a result of multiple drivers such as land use change, exploitation, climate change, and others. These are the results of indirect drivers, themselves conditioned by our values and behaviors. Throughout the world, indigenous people and their knowledge are also experiencing the same decline. However, they have contributed to shape the diverse ecosystems and forms of life we find on Earth nowadays. About 20 years ago, a group of indomitable goats invaded one of the most pristine parks in southern Africa. I personally worked mostly outside the park with a mixed community of Nambia, Tonga, and Ndebele, and Shona people living on the edge of two protected areas, Wangi National Park and Sikomi Forest, hosting one of the highest density of free-ranging elephants in the world. The region of Wangi has been shaped by the presence of coal in the ground and its colonial history. The creation of Wangé National Park began with the eviction of indigenous people and the large predators that were present in the park. This was followed by the drilling of 85 boreholes inside the park, which greatly transformed the ecology of the area and increased the herbivore population, so that they had to introduce a culling. Between 1966 and 1986, 15,000 elephants have been killed. After independence, foreign institutions such as WWF started to invest in community-based natural resource management programs, such as Campfire. Today, Wangé belongs to one of the biggest megaparks in the world, the Casa Transfrontière Conservation Area, which was founded in 2006 with the intention to sustainably manage the Kavango-Zambezi ecosystem, its heritage and cultural resources, based on best conservation and tourism models for the socio-economic well-being of the communities and other stakeholders in and around the ecoregion, through harmonization of policy, strategies, and practice. For the past 20 years, the focus on conservation has largely overpowered the efforts to support local communities. PROSULI is a program funded by the European Union, which proposes to use collaborative monitoring and evaluation processes to explore and promote sustainable livelihoods in transfrontier conservation areas. Our approach is based on participatory prospective analysis. The idea is to identify forces of change and define the system to then unravel driving forces that will be used to design different scenarios. And from these scenarios, through process of backcasting, we start engaging in actions. So this approach was replicated at ward level in Ward 15 of Wangé district through a 5-day workshop where we gathered 24 knowledge brokers from different institutions or background, and also at village level where we gathered opinions of 66 women, 35 men, and 69 young persons. So what are the driving forces perceived by this community? At ward level, we found a lot of consistencies across the different 4 sites where we had work. Among those drivers, especially in Wangé, we found community and governance, land use regulation and allocation, state of natural resources, local culture, farming systems, and livestock management. The process facilitated at the village level was slightly different, and the 2 main drivers identified by people were water and economic development. This process led the community at village level to design 10 actions that could positively influence the future of their livelihood. 9 of them correspond to classic interventions targeted by NGOs, such as fixing boreholes, installing solar pumps, building dams, developing capacity and skills, implementing small remnants projects, develop local market or community-based tourism. But the village heads also stressed that any of those interventions will be likely to be successful without first nurturing a culture of respect in the community. These ideas were just taken at higher level to connect the dots and leverage transformation. The next meeting was organized at the district administrator offices in Wangé, where we gathered 45 participants with gender and age equity, and this was facilitated by the PROSULI team. The meeting includes 6 village heads, some NGOs, GGF and Agritechs, 8 councillors, some journalists, and representatives of Ministry of Local Government, Ministry of Women Affairs, Ministry of Youth, Sports, Arts and Recreation, and the Forestry Commission. We facilitated a process to assess the sensibility of the design actions in terms of impact, feasibility, cost, and risk that we ranked on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low and 5 being high. The development of water infrastructure were ranked high in terms of feasibility and impact and involved the most costly interventions. People express diverging opinions when assessing the potential for dam development in relation to catchment capacity and climate change, which call for further research. Other risks including the donor dependence, especially for maintenance, issues around ownership and inter-community politics, as well as risk associated with zoonotic diseases. Community-based tourism ranked comparatively lower in terms of feasibility and impact. Concerns arise related to how to distribute wealth generated, community participation, challenge, market competition. But later, we wonder whether this model is very viable in the context of global pandemics. Finally, nurturing a respect ranked high in terms of feasibility and impact. It was believed to be quite low cost, but raised a number of issues, especially social issues like barriers over indigenous beliefs and knowledge systems, communities that are not homogeneous, issues of globalization and mobility, poverty, economic hardship, which force people to rely more and more on natural resources, and global carelessness. So what futures for this community? Should they adapt or die? This idea of nurturing a culture of respect was quite new for my colleagues. And we got the opportunity to propose the community we work with to draft a document to submit to the IPBES call for contributions on indigenous knowledge system. And in this document, they developed their vision of nurturing a culture of respect, which I'm going to read to you. Nurturing a culture of respect is finding means to protect, care for, nourish, support, and develop the social behaviors, the customs, norms, laws, beliefs, habits, attitudes, knowledge, and perceptions that can ensure maximum moral consideration and respect for the biosphere and for all. Taboos, proverbs, poetry, music, dance, games, folktale used to teach love, gratitude, respect, praise, retribution, and health, among other attributes that encourage the spirit of Bunu, humanity, when relating to living and non-living natural entities. Respect starts with self-identity, then appreciation of the phenomenon and the study. While indigenous knowledge systems are quite useful for the biosphere, they are threatened by a number of factors, such as technology and science, globalization, global warming, modernization, religion, and forms of communication coming from the more civilized part of the world, among others. Language is a carrier of culture, so the first point of call is education. Cultural conservation should be introduced fully in the school curriculum, where learners learn the importance of culture and personal identity. So this verse showed us that we all share the same concern, but with different words and actions. Indigenous and local communities' worldview may shed light on many issues our societies are experiencing today. So this call for deep transformation, not only in conservation science and practices, but also at personal levels. 2 years ago, when I was invited to present at a plenary session of SAWMA, I discussed a lot about transdisciplinarity, and we need to push this avenue further by decolonizing our minds, histories, access, expertise, and embrace a more ethical approach to nature. The need to respect nature and its limits challenges society and conservation science. and maybe one of the way forward for the Casa Transfrontière Conservation Area would be to reframe the statement of the mission to protect and nurture the Casa ecosystem, natural and cultural resources, for the socio-economic well-being of local communities, as well as future generations, through collaboration and adaptive policies, strategies, and practice. I thank you for the time you're giving me today, and I wish you a wonderful conference. Bye.
You can hear me, probably can now. Thank you, Chloe. Please ask Chloe any questions or comments on the YouTube comment channel. Our next talk is Bakholise, and he is going to be telling us about the poaching and perceptions of poaching. Thank you very much.
Good day. My name is Bako Jojo, and I'm the Community Projects Lead at WWF South Africa for the KETA program, which is funded by the United States Agency for International Development and implemented by WWF South Africa. Today, I'll be taking you through a qualitative research which we undertook to understand community attitudes towards crime. The research looked at the relationship between local people and protected areas, and also the perceptions of safety and security of local communities within the context of high levels of illegal wildlife trade taking place within the landscape. So a lot of research has been done, especially in the south of Kruger, and especially about wildlife crime. And one thing that kept coming up from the communities was that we care so much about the safety and protection of wildlife, especially the rhino, and that there are so many programs in the landscape which are focused on the protection of wildlife. But when it comes to the safety and protection of the communities, nothing much has been done. And that communities are really asked about issues related to their safety and security. So it's these kinds of narratives that motivated us to undertake the study in an attempt to learn more about issues that matter in the communities outside of wildlife crime. The research was done with Dr. Annette Hupschler. It took place over a period of 2 years between June 2018 and July 2020. The research took place in the southwestern boundary of Kruger National Park and was firmly rooted in qualitative social science methodology, where 25 people were interviewed, including women of all ages, who tend to be underrepresented in rural research samples. The interviewees also consisted of general community members, farmers, environmental monitors, South African police services, staff, and ward councillors. Our research found that participants were proud members of their community and spoke fondly about their neighbors and the community at large. There was an overwhelming sense of community life was governed by the principle of Ubuntu. But however, the interview data also showed that many community members expressed negative sentiments towards internal migrants and foreign nationals. A recurring theme in the interviews was the dire economic situation and lack of employment opportunities in rural areas. And while some interview participants said that they were able to put bread or food on the table, most said that they were living in impoverished conditions. And in many instances, a recipient of a governmental social grant, whether it's a child support grant or old age pension, would support several other family members. So both during the pilot study and the subsequent fieldwork phase, service delivery protests were taking place in the area when we were doing the interviews. And while we did not directly address the protest action during the interviewing process, the conversation ultimately would turn to community members expressing sentiments of abandonment and feeling left out either by the South African government, protected areas, and the private sector. The majority of the people we interviewed thought that the relationship between local communities and protected areas was not good, and they gave the following reasons which were affecting this relationship. They mentioned jobs going to outsiders. Most respondents felt that community members were being overlooked or not notified of recruitment drives in protected areas, and that jobs were going to outsiders who had no link to local communities. Things like access to private reserves. Community members said it was difficult to gain access to protected areas for the purposes of visiting family members who were employed in the reserves or park. Issues around wildlife, human-wildlife conflict and compensation schemes. Human-wildlife conflict was a recurring theme. There was this perception of unfairness and selectiveness and undue disparities of compensation schemes paid out by private game reserves versus Kruger National Park. There were also issues around access to ancestral sites and graves, where respondents stated that they were unable to gain access to ancestral sites and graves inside the Kruger National Park as and when they desired. There was also mention of no benefits from conservation. So, although we try to stay clear from conversations about the act of rhino poaching, it was the most important talking point in our research sample, with either poaching or anti-poaching mentioned in about 77 separate contexts. This finding in itself is quite remarkable and points to how rhino poaching and anti-poaching impact many layers of community life. And unfortunately, the most worrisome findings were reports of alleged severe human rights violations by anti-poaching personnel, which also extended to family members and bystanders. Under the theme Perceptions of Safety and Security of Local Communities, stock theft was considered the most serious crime concern, where heads of cattle, sheep, goats, and chicken were frequently stolen, slaughtered, and sold to butcheries in neighboring villages and towns. Also, unsurprisingly, nearly half of the research participants considered South Africa's second pandemic, which is gender-based violence, a serious threat to community safety. Drug use in the community was also a great concern, and high incidences of corruption in rural communities was also mentioned as a growing safety concern. So earlier I mentioned that there's this negative sentiment towards migrants and foreign nationals. Foreign nationals and undocumented migrants were stigmatized and perceived to be responsible for most criminal activities. Outsiders were described as local people who recently moved to the village from either other municipalities or other regions of South Africa. And these outsiders were also portrayed as criminals. Several respondents acknowledged that their neighbors were involved in crime. Young men and boys were identified as thieves who were breaking into schools, breaking into homes and businesses, and also stealing motor vehicles and livestock. Mirroring trends elsewhere in South Africa as well, perpetrators of gender-based violence were described as intimate partners, friends, or family of the survivor. When asked what are the structural and socio-economic drivers of the crimes committed at community level, the respondents provided thought-provoking responses to this question. Several research participants saw poverty, inequality, and unemployment as drivers of crime. Problematic alcohol and drug abuse were seen as drivers of gender-based violence and property crimes. There was mention of boredom and lack of opportunities, which would push young boys towards mischief and crime. There was also a very fascinating observation that the recent construction of a tarred access road to one of the villages opened up a highway for thieves and gangsters. Research respondents at several research sites mentioned that they had to travel to the closest town to report cases of serious crime at a police station that serviced several other villages. And there are small police satellite offices in the community or in the village, but of course with limited operations. But beyond the logistical issue of getting to a police station, several respondents were distrustful of the police. There were several respondents who had given up on the police and were allegedly either taking the law into their own hands or referring criminal cases to traditional leaders. It's widely accepted that the state does not have the political will to meet security needs of local communities around the world, and especially in South Africa. So other actor groups have filled that gap, including private security companies, neighborhood watches, and community policing forums. So respondents expressed concern about anti-poaching responses leveled not only against rhino poaching suspects, but at random community members. Several research participants had allegedly been caught up in roadblocks and house searches carried out by private anti-poaching units and ranges where SAPs either were not present or the required search warrants were not shown to the community members. Respondents also spoke of human rights violations and unpermitted use of heavy-handed law enforcement during these interrogations of poaching suspects or their family members. So in closing, through this process, we have also developed guidelines with best practice for conducting interviews with communities. And we're happy to share these with anyone interested, especially those of you who are doing community-based research. We're happy to share these through ALMA, and also the results of the research, of this particular research, will inform a shared community wildlife safety strategy and implementation plan, which will be co-designed with key partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pakulise. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, so we've got 5 minutes before our next presentation, which will be by Tim. So if you need a leg stretch or a body break, now is your time. We'll start again at 11:15. All right, folks, thanks very much. We are now going to move on with the program. Our next speaker, also a virtual presenter, is Tim, and Tim is going to be presenting some data on ranger-collected biodiversity data. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone, and hello from Cape Town, wishing I was there with most of you in Kruger. The photo on the right of your screen is one that I took during my PhD fieldwork in Zimbabwe. This ranger was on a regular patrol in Mana Pools National Park in the north of the country and encountered an elephant carcass and is recording it on a handheld device. My PhD focused on ranger-collected data on elephant poaching, and I was investigating whether or not ranger-collected data could be used to reliably track changes in poaching over time and space, first of all. And second of all, whether, and if so, how, park managers use ranger-collected data to inform their park management and anti-poaching strategies. Today I'll give you a broad overview of my PhD and my main results. And then I want to talk more generally about lessons I've learned regarding how we can unlock the potential of ranger-collected data. I really believe there is a lot of potential in the data that rangers collect globally, not just on poaching, and all sorts of things. And I want to talk about the lessons I've learned about how we might tap into that value and potential. First, I want to show you a short video from my field site.
That one is on the other side, and this one is on the other side. It's a elephant carcass.
Yes. So that's how data are collected. And here are some quotes from park managers in Mana Pools about how data are used to track poaching, to find out where elephant poaching hotspots are, to inform decisions more generally, and to evaluate management, whether if rangers keep recording more carcasses, as one manager says, then you know you are failing somewhere. So moving on to an outline for the rest of the talk, I want to give you more background on my PhD and ranger-based monitoring more generally, and then a brief overview of some of my main results, and apologies in advance, I won't be able to go into detail on these because I want more time for this third point to share the lessons I've learned in the form of 5 steps for unlocking the value of ranger-collected data. So onto the background. I think there's a real opportunity here, and I'm not the first one to see it. And that is that there are hundreds of thousands of rangers operating every day around the world, encountering all sorts of plants and animals and evidence of illegal activity while on patrol. This creates large volumes of data, valuable data. Secondly, this is a cost-efficient form of data collection because rangers are on patrol any day, anyway, and any day for that matter. But of course, with any good thing, there is a caveat. There are challenges. Firstly, and perhaps obviously, there's this challenge of patrol effort bias. So this is a map of elephant carcasses detected by rangers over 17 years at my case study site. The question is, are these gaps places where there is no poaching, or could they reflect where rangers do not patrol frequently? Similarly, these temporal changes in poaching across years, do these reflect real changes in poaching, or do they reflect changes in the number of ranger patrols or the coverage of ranger patrols in certain years compared to others? So that's the challenge of data bias. The second challenge has to do with translating data into better decisions for conservation. As you can see, monitoring and data collection is just one part of this broader adaptive management cycle. And it's important that ranger-collected data are embedded within a broader adaptive management cycle that ensures that the information are actually used by managers. But that's easier said than done, as we will see a bit later. So this is my study site, as mentioned, the Mana Chawari Sapi World Heritage Site. My questions were to understand the reliability of ranger collected data, and secondly, the extent to which these data are used by park managers, as mentioned. Moving on to my results, very briefly again. So, these two maps show maps created of elephant poaching hotspots based on 17 years of ranger collected data in Chawari Safari area. Now, as you can see, using the data directly in spatial distribution models results in a certain distribution of poaching, whereas if you correct for patrol bias by controlling for the fact that rangers patrol in some areas more than others, you would draw different conclusions about where poaching hotspots are, just illustrating the importance of controlling for patrol bias. Can't go into detail about the method I used, but there are methods to correct for patrol bias. In my second chapter, a quantitative chapter again, I looked at the question of whether rangers' data can reliably track elephant poaching. The obvious problem here is that what is the true poaching level to compare ranger collected data to? A way around this is to use mathematical simulation models, and basically this involves simulating various scenarios of ranger patrol dynamics and elephant poaching dynamics. So in this video you see the ranger patrols as represented by the green squares are changing over time. This was simulated, and certain ranger patrols detect elephant carcasses, which are represented by the black dots. Not every carcass in a patrolled area is detected, in fact only a few, and the detected carcasses are those red dots. So you can simulate different types of patrols, different levels of patrol coverage, different detectabilities of carcasses, and evaluate the effect of all of those factors on the ability of ranger patrol data to track poaching. And as you can see here, you have the simulated real data, real poaching data, and the simulated detected data, which allows us to answer questions like this one. If poaching were to increase by 50%, what are the chances that ranger patrols would detect that change if there were 9 patrols a month? These are the kinds of questions you can answer with the model. And as you can see, it's very difficult for small changes in poaching to be detected. But if the changes in poaching are larger, the chances of rangers detecting them increases. I did some qualitative work as well. I interviewed rangers and park managers, and I wanted to understand, what do rangers think of data collection? What really shone through in the interview responses was a strong sense of duty amongst the rangers and deference to their supervisors. As the quotes illustrate, rangers wanted to demonstrate that they had done a good job by bringing back data from the field. This is not an exhaustive list of results, but another theme in the results was that rangers desired feedback on the data they collect. As that one ranger says, if we need to know how the data we collect is used so that we do it in a good way. If we did not know how it was used, we would just leave the carcasses without recording them. Important that rangers get feedback. Even more briefly, I interviewed managers and asked them what they thought of data-based adaptive management. Some great responses here. Managers, by and large, did not really take ownership of data analysis and trend analysis. They didn't see how these new forms of management really were better than what they were already doing. Finally, onto the bigger picture, taking a step back. And as I said, I wanted to ask this question: how can we unlock the potential of ranger collected data? These are 5 suggested steps based on what I've learned in my PhD. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'd be really keen to hear your ideas and thoughts in the question time and afterwards. Please do email me. So before we even begin, it's important, as mentioned earlier, that ranger-based monitoring is embedded within an adaptive management cycle. So this cycle basically makes it clear how the data are going to be used for management, and it also defines the different roles. This is a diagram I developed together with the Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management Authority. Zooming in now, the first specific step is to set goals for how the data will be used. So a management goal might be to reduce bushmeat hunting, and a data need might be to collect information on bushmeat snares and see how that changes over time. So, a different case study from elephant poaching. The second step would be to critically assess whether the data has the power to meet these goals, to track these changes in poaching. Is patrol effort and coverage wide enough? How often do rangers detect snares? Thirdly, it's important to understand that data are most often biased, and to account for this bias, fortunately, there are ways of doing so. Fourth step is to define clear ways for how monitoring data will inform action. By this I mean ways from going to data to change decisions, specific ways. So one might be a decision trigger in which managers act when bushmeat snare detection rates rise above 50%, for example. This is a very difficult step, and I think an area for future research is developing these decision support tools, these decision triggers. And more generally, it's important to foster collaboration between the scientists and the researchers who analyze the monitoring data, for example, and the managers who manage the park. This relationship is very difficult, but essential. And then an overall top tip, my 5 cents about how we can untap the potential of ranger collector data, and that is really to be cognizant of and be sensitive to the perspectives and pressures of the people who collect and use the data. I think these are often underappreciated, and that's why we often see adaptive management failing. We need to understand what the park managers actually need, for example. As I said, I really would be keen to hear your ideas, so please do suggest them to me in question time, but also by email. And then finally, I'm now doing my postdoc in statistics at the UCT Center for Statistics in Ecology and Conservation, and we're looking for case study sites and case studies in general of ranger-based monitoring data sets, for example, that we could work with in terms of statistical analysis. If you know of anything, if you'd like to collaborate, please do get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have one more in this run of presentations of a virtual presentation coming up before we move back to some in-person presentations. Yes, there's one more hour to go to lunch, so you will be able to refresh yourselves then, so keep going. The next presentation is by Chloe Lucas, and she's going to be telling us a bit more about perceptions around human-carnivore conflict. Thank you, Chloe.
Hello, I'm Chloe. Today I'll be sharing with you some findings from my PhD research. So just to set the scene, my PhD explores evaluating human-carnivore coexistence from a socio-ecological approach, and to do this uses a combination of social science and ecological methods. For this talk, I'll be focusing on one chapter which explores stakeholder perceptions of success and coexistence using interview data. International interest in increasing coexistence between humans and carnivores has led to the development of numerous techniques largely designed to reduce livestock depredation. For example, fortified corrals, livestock guardian dogs, electric fencing, herders, and fledgling. These interventions are primarily designed to reduce livestock loss, presuming that a reduction in livestock loss will facilitate coexistence between farmers and carnivores. Subsequently, studies of their effectiveness tend to involve quantitative measurements of livestock loss before and after strategy implementation. However, whether strategies achieve their desired outcomes relies on numerous factors, including willingness to adopt intervention strategies and changes in human behaviour. For interventions to have the desired ecological and social outcomes, it is therefore essential to understand how interventions are perceived by different stakeholders and the factors that contribute to perceptions of success. The aim of my study was to explore how a range of stakeholders measure and perceive the success of these strategies. It also explored the factors that contribute to perceptions of success and whether stakeholders perceive that coexistence can be achieved. My study took place in the Capricorn and Venby districts in the very north of the Limpopo province, South Africa. The area is predominantly rural and is largely made up of crop, game and livestock farms. The area is a typical example of the dualistic economy that occurs in South Africa, where large commercial farms exist alongside smaller subsistence farming communities. The farmers in my study would typically be classed as commercial farmers, as they mainly produce livestock for commercial sales and markets. The area is situated within the Venby Biosphere Reserve and contains some protected areas. A wide variety of carnivore species are known to live or disperse through the area, including leopard, brown hyena, black-backed jackal, caracal, spotted hyena, and some cheetah and wild dog. In order to explore stakeholder perceptions of success, I conducted interviews using a method called grounded theory. I'll explain a bit about the method here. Grounded theory allows for theories and concepts to emerge from the data. The method is not limited to a specific field or discipline, but has only recently begun to be used in conservation studies. It is both a method and a theory in which the processes of data collection and analysis emerged, so as the researcher, I moved back and forth between the two. Firstly, purposeful sampling was used to interview target participants, so in this case, farmers with livestock and conservation stakeholders working in the area. The first interviews were then transcribed and coded. Coding is done in 3 phases: initial, focused, and theoretical. As theories began to emerge, I identified common themes and decided which needed further exploration. I then went back to data collection and recruited participants with the idea that they would be able to contribute to these theories. This process of moving between the interviews and analysis occurred until theoretical saturation, when no new theories emerged, was reached. Grounded theory does not use a representative sample, but aims to really pull apart what is being said by participants. As a method, it provides an in-depth insight into participant experiences. The use of grounded theory helped to draw out novel aspects of intervention success and gain a more in-depth understanding of stakeholder perceptions. I conducted 31 interviews in total. The 20 livestock farmers had cattle, goats, sheep, and mixed herds. They used a variety of mitigation strategies, including corrals, electric fences, livestock guardian dogs, herders, and lethal control methods such as shooting, cage traps, and poison. Farmers use any combination of these methods. The conservation stakeholders worked for conservation NGOs within the study area. The protected area authority stakeholders managed private or government reserves within the area. The tourism operator owned land for tourism purposes and therefore had an interest in carnivore conservation. I will now explore the perceptions of success and coexistence that emerged from my study. The majority of participants measured success by a reduction in livestock loss. This was measured in a number of ways, including numerical difference in losses before and after mitigation use, reduced incidence of loss or injury, and increased percentage of livestock young raised from birth. Change in potential for loss was also considered a measure of success. Again, this was measured in a variety of ways, for example, seeing fewer carnivore tracks at corrals, and the physical separation of livestock and carnivores, usually through the use of fences. 2 farmers expressed the idea that success cannot be measured. All 11 conservation stakeholders thought that successful intervention strategies were possible. However, 3 farmers felt that successful strategies were not possible. 3 major themes emerged as factors that contributed to participants' overall perception of success: trust, word of mouth, and acceptance. Trust was a major theme, and there were 3 main areas where trust was important in shaping perceptions of success. These were trust of interventions, farmer trust of conservationists, and conservationist trust of farmers. Farmers may be supported by conservationists on the basis that if they are provided with a mitigation strategy, they will cease all lethal control on their property. Conservationists must trust farmers to adhere to this in order to achieve their goals. Similarly, farmers must trust conservationists that the strategies they recommend or implement will work. Building trust between farmers and conservationists was considered fundamental in understanding perceptions of success. To build this trust, conservationists must be visible, transparent, and have a presence in farming communities. For farmers to trust conservationists, local socio-political customs should be acknowledged, and one conservation stakeholder highlighted how they employed staff with different backgrounds to work within different communities, which in turn increased trust and mitigation use in their project. This is particularly important in a socially diverse country like South Africa. Communicating the success of interventions was found to be best via farmer networks. All farmers in the study reported that they were more likely to trust the opinions of other farmers in comparison to conservation stakeholders. However, the importance of word of mouth in communicating success also means that bad experiences are widely shared and could create a barrier to mitigation use. The reputation of a mitigation strategy can therefore spread quickly through farming communities and must be taken into consideration when evaluating success. In cases where this occurs, it can have long-term implications and could result in farmers avoiding to use particular strategies. There were two aspects to acceptance, the first being that the majority of participants acknowledged that it's impossible to stop livestock losses completely, and losses to carnivores were largely considered part of farming in the area. The second was the acceptance of the opinion of others, and it was found that mitigation use cannot be forced onto farmers, and not all farmers will be willing to try strategies, even if others consider them successful. For example, one conservation participant reported how a farm made complaints about a reserve's leopards, and in response, the stakeholder placed a guard dog on the farm. However, the farmer did not cooperate with training the dog, and in the end, the dog had to be removed. Conservationists therefore have to respect the opinion of farmers and must accept that methods don't work for everyone, even if they're successful for the majority. In terms of coexistence, a common feature amongst participants' definitions was an acknowledgement of being able to live in the same area and there being a place for both people and wildlife. There was a general agreement among stakeholder groups as to what coexistence means. Coexistence between farmers and carnivores was thought possible by the majority of participants. 4 participants thought that coexistence between livestock farmers and carnivores was not possible, whilst 5 participants indicated that coexistence was only possible in reserves and protected areas. In order to achieve coexistence, 4 major categories to address emerged. These were support, information access, respect, and mindset change. It was felt farmers must have support from conservation or government stakeholders for coexistence to be achieved. Farmers must be aware of the support available to them, along with knowledge of the available strategies and how best to use these to achieve desired outcomes. Information about the different strategies should be made widely available. Expectations of interventions need to be understood, particularly if a certain level of livestock loss is still expected to occur. These expectations need to be managed, and conservation stakeholders have an important role in communicating the goals of strategies and the roles of all stakeholders in using them. Achieving coexistence is therefore related to managing and keeping expectations realistic. In this study, stakeholder groups acknowledged that they must respect each other's values to enable the collaboration needed for a coexistence. A change in farmers' mindset was considered important by all stakeholder groups. Whilst historically farmers may have attempted to eradicate carnivores on their property, participants indicated that this was beginning to change and the younger generation was more willing to coexist with carnivores. However, changing people's attitude or tolerance to wildlife is likely to occur slowly. To conclude, the user-grounded theory emphasised the individual nature of human-carnivore coexistence experiences, where perceptions of success were influenced by various factors. Despite this, the majority of participants based their measures on changes in livestock loss. This suggests that using livestock loss as a measure of success can be universally understood by all stakeholder groups. Recent calls in the scientific literature for evaluations to place greater focus on the use of controlled experimental designs and reduce reliance on farmer recall may not suit the interests of all stakeholders. Academic critique of the use of farmer recall to determine success may not be entirely relevant, as measures of livestock loss were relied on heavily by farmers and so are likely to influence behaviour changes and impact the continued use of interventions. Therefore, assessing changes in attitude and behaviour as a result of intervention use may be more important than assessing functional effectiveness to ensure that interventions are achieving desired goals, such as the reduced persecution of carnivores. Importantly, the farming community will only use methods they perceive as successful, and word of mouth emerged as the best way to share successes. However, farmer networks can also spread negative information about interventions, and one failed experience can have wider repercussions. In-depth qualitative studies highlight the impact that the extreme minority could have on achieving coexistence goals. This highlights the vital role of social science methods in conservation studies. Thank you for listening, and please do get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Chloe. As usual, please post any questions on the YouTube channel for Chloe to answer. We are running ahead with the virtual presentations. We have learned something already. Next year, when we do it, we will slot them up so that we have fewer spaces. But because we have a program that we need to stick to, we're going to have to ask our next presenter to just stand by for 5 minutes so you can stretch your legs, and then I'll get us underway in a few minutes. Thank you very much.
touchscreen, so you can just point like that.
Oh, okay.
But then to get rid of it, just make sure you slide it through.
Thank you. Right, folks, we're going to get underway again. Our next presentation is going to be about shepherding as a tool in the Northern Cape, and it's going to be given by Leon Mini. Thank you, Leon.
Thanks, Dan, for creating such an anticipation for this presentation. I hope I don't disappoint you guys. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Leon Mini. I'm from the University of Mpumalanga. And yes, I am presenting in person, to the dismay of some people. So this talk, I will be focusing on the impacts of shepherding on... Sorry, Sam. My boss said I must do this. I can't get off. So I'm going to focus on the impacts of shepherding and how that can actually assist in reducing livestock predation. This study looked at a case study in the Northern Cape province. So I'm sure most of you are aware, even the students among us, that carnivores have been killing livestock since we domesticated ungulates. This conflict is particularly important because it can actually threaten the persistence of both the livestock farmers and the carnivores on their farms. So livestock farming can be threatened through predation itself, as well as the increase in costs associated with managing this predation threat, while carnivore persistence can be threatened through lethal management approaches. This has resulted in the reduction of the range of many carnivores across farming areas and can also result in the collapse of ecological structure and function in these agro-ecosystems. In addition, these lethal methods, there's no reliable scientific evidence that actually suggests that it's economically and ecologically feasible to use these methods. And some results actually suggest that these methods may produce counterintuitive results or increase livestock predation, particularly the lethal methods. And because of this, there's been a recent surge in the advocacy for using of non-lethal methods, as non-lethal methods are more sustainable, and some results have shown that it can actually be more effective in reducing livestock predation than other lethal methods. So given the actual and perceived impacts that carnivores have on livestock, farmers employ a variety of both lethal, non-lethal, or mixed approaches in managing livestock predation on their farms. But the application of these different techniques differs depending on the land tenures. And in South Africa, and particularly in this study area as well, we have generally poor communal farmers, and these poor resourced communal farmers tend to use cheap methods such as kraals and in particular shepherding. And shepherding is used widely in South Africa and in Africa. In contrast, the well-resourced commercial farmers tend to use a mixture of more expensive methods, including lethal and non-lethal methods. Irrespective of the land tenure, the application of these methods tend to be driven by personal opinions, communal opinions. So my neighbor says shooting a jackal works, so I'm going to shoot a jackal. And not many of these methods have been scrutinized scientifically. And so there's no systematic evaluation of the efficacy of these methods. However, internationally, there has been some work done on the efficacy of these methods. In a review of non-lethal methods practiced across 23 countries, they recently found that across 117 of the interventions, only 5% of those interventions included shepherding. So that just shows that there's not a lot of research being published on the efficacy of shepherding, and it's being widely used but not published. In addition, in South Africa, there is no evidence on the impact of shepherding. Does it work? Does it not work? And this has been highlighted by the scientific assessment on livestock predation. So because of the paucity of information, we hypothesize that shepherding will actually reduce small stock losses compared to other livestock management methods. To assess this, we used an unplanned experimental design. Everyone's raising their eyebrows, especially Sam probably. But yes, it was unplanned, and we used two data sets emanating from the Northern Cape. These data sets differed predominantly in the presence and absence of livestock farmers. No, not, they all had livestock farmers. In the presence or absence of shepherds. So the first data set was an observational data set where we had shepherds on the ground that were collecting data. They actually observed kills and then identified the predator responsible for those kills. Those shepherds collected data between 2012 and 2016, and they were deployed on both communal lands and private farming areas, commercial farmers. The second data set was collected via telephonic interviews between 2006 and 2007, and these mostly covered private commercial farmers. So we acknowledge that these are two disparate data sets. Okay? They each have their own biases, and this may affect the comparisons we draw here and the conclusions, but we think it's extremely important to use these alternative approaches, particularly in areas where no actual data sets exists, to test the effects of, for example, shepherding in reducing livestock losses. In fact, most of these data sets do not exist for any of the livestock and predator management actions employed in South Africa as a whole. So those of you that raised your eyebrows of me using two separate data sets, we had to combine them somehow, and our basis for comparison was twofold. First of all, data was collected in the same habitat types, the same climate, the same geology, and the farmers had the same livestock types. In addition, we looked at the dominant predators of the two data sets. So irrespective of the data set, the proportion of livestock killed by jackal and caracal were similar. There was no statistical difference between the two data sets. So this, in conjunction with the other factors I mentioned, we used to amalgamate the data sets, and we then use this to address our hypothesis whether shepherding would reduce livestock predation. Some social scientists are looking at me very strange at the moment. So, this is the dangers of ecologists doing social sciences. The first thing we did was we looked at the two data sets and we tried to figure out what are the main drivers of livestock losses between these data sets. We did this using a boosted regression tree, and the main drivers included management, which explained 46% of the variation in the data set, management being shepherding versus non-shepherding, herd size explained 32%, location 14%, and land tenure only explained 0.5% of the variation in the data. In addition, land tenure was also collinear, so we removed it from the following analysis. We then used these results to determine the order that we use the predictive variables in the linear mixed effects models to test whether shepherding is actually resulting in a reduction in livestock losses. So for overall livestock losses, the best model included management, which is shepherding versus non-shepherding, livestock type, and herd size. So if we look at the livestock losses and compare them between the two data sets, we can see that there was a significant reduction in the amount of livestock loss when shepherds were employed. In fact, it was a 5-fold reduction. As livestock type was an important driver in these losses, we aimed to develop models for each of the livestock breeds and demographic classes as well. Unfortunately, the commercial farmers only ran sheep and lambs, whereas the communal farmers also had goats. So that made our comparison, well, null and void. So the only models that we could identify with enough data was predation on lambs and predation on sheep. So focusing specifically on lamb predation, the model that explained the most variation in the data set included management and herd size, but here only management was significant. Herd size was not significant. So when we look at that graph, you can see that farmers that employed herders had significantly less livestock predation on lambs than farmers that did not employ herders. In fact, there was a 7-fold reduction in livestock losses. So our results suggest that shepherding can in fact be more effective than other lethal and non-lethal livestock predation management techniques. Specifically, it resulted in a 5-fold reduction in overall livestock losses and a 7-fold reduction in small stock losses. However, we acknowledge that this comparison is based on an unplanned experimental design of two disparate but comparable data sets. And as I've mentioned, there are biases inherent in both methods of data collection. For example, the shepherds could have been a hot day, like the dogs we saw in the previous presentation. On the hot day, they don't work, so they're not collecting data. So they might have underrepresented the actual number of livestock losses. Conversely, questionnaire data, it's influenced by opinion and feelings, and most of the cases it's overestimated, especially when you have a bakkie boer, or someone that only has their right arm brown and the other one slightly less brown. But interestingly enough, when we compared the overall trends in a reduction in livestock losses to studies on an international basis that used a gold standard design, so that's a control and experimental design or before-after experimental design, we saw similar trends. Shepherding in those international studies, like our study, also reduced predation. In fact, most of these studies say that shepherding is probably one of the most effective anti-predation measures you can apply on a farm if you apply it correctly. So finally, non-lethal methods, like shepherding in this case, they are preferred from a least harm perspective, and they are also more acceptable ecologically on farms. So in conclusion, our results highlight two important aspects. First of all, some data is better than no data. We've highlighted an opportunity by combining data sets, particularly in data-scarce research areas such as this. We can get a general impression of the drivers of certain aspects. For example, is shepherding reducing livestock losses? In addition, this allows us to provide robust hypotheses which can be addressed by future research. And the hypotheses that we provide and we hope that people will address in the future is that shepherding reduces livestock predation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Leon. Are there questions from the floor? I see, just run up to a microphone, please, France. Just while France is going up, we need the guys online to hear. So you can stand here.
Just be careful about this question.
Do you think shepherding is a socially and economically realistic career?
Oh, okay. Well, France, I think you're overqualified, though. The problem with shepherding, it's viewed as a low-skill job in South Africa. So that's the one thing. I think that speaks directly to your question. The other thing of using shepherds, farmers tend to say, when we use shepherds, there's an increase in stock theft. There's an increase in poaching. And they also do not like the increase in labor costs. So all else being equal, shepherding will reduce livestock, or should reduce livestock losses, but obviously it needs to be evaluated in socioeconomic terms as well. Our data set was tenuous at best, so addressing anything else than the hypothesis we set out to do would be wouldn't be that good, yeah.
Still have time for another question. If there's anybody, you can jump up to the microphones, but just to highlight a comment that one of our in-person delegates, Dr. Sam Ferreira on YouTube, made. What do you think you could, the kinds of linkages you could make, Leon, when it comes to this shepherding example for other species, like rhinos? Do you think it's something that's feasible?
What do I mean, rhino shepherds? Yeah, so I mean, a lot of reserves have rhino monitors. So whether it's feasible or not, and I know exactly where Sam is going about the poaching aspect. I reckon that's where he's going. So trust humans, you can't trust humans, but can you trust humans? So yes, it may, in an ideal world, it will work, but the human element emerges, particularly I think with the rhino example when people are doing badly socioeconomically, they don't have enough money to feed their people, things creep in, where they take a quick buck in order to make some cash. Does that make sense? I don't know if that was what you were referring to, Sam. I'm assuming you were talking about rhino monitors.
Yeah, I am, but I first of all want to caution you to start making conclusions about everybody is bad when they don't have money. That's not true. No, people don't make decisions because they're greedy. That's very important. So I'm very wary about that comment about not trusting people. I think most people can be trusted. Give them a bloody reason to be trusted. Don't just throw them around. Now, I was thinking about that. One of the things that we have been arguing is that when you look at how we deal with protecting species, doesn't matter whether it's rhinos or anything else, virtually all our anti-poaching work in South Africa focuses on chasing the poacher. Okay? You don't see a shepherd running around looking for the jackals on a farm.
Yeah.
Okay? They're with their animals, and I think that's the sort of things I'm trying to alleviate.
Yeah. I mean, shepherding is the oldest profession in the world. Okay? I mean, when we domesticated livestock, we had shepherds, and it's been working for so long. Whether it's socioeconomically viable on commercial farms, different story.
Yeah. Thanks, Leon. Next is Eli. Eli is going to be telling us about wildlife, using citizen science to determine a wildlife occurrence. Thank you very much, Eli.
So good day, everyone. My name is Eli Padaros. I'm a PhD student at the International Research Lab Rehabs, supervised by Professor Hervé Fritz and Dr. Kröger. And today I'm going to talk about rallying citizen knowledge to assess wildlife occurrence and habitat suitability in anthropogenic landscapes. So to put a little bit of context, the environmental crisis is nested in social ecological processes. That's what was shown by the integration of 17 sustainable development goals across 3 embedded cylinders, the biosphere, the society, and the economy. And it's a call for a need to integrate public knowledge, views, and values into the debate. And that's what citizen science can offer. It allows large temporal and spatial extents and compilation of considerable amount of data. And considering other dimensions of the problematic implies to rethink why and how we do conservation. That's me going beyond the traditional separation between human and nature. And that's what prompts the idea of reconciliation ecology formulated by Michael Rosenzweig, which advocates the creation and the maintenance of favorable spaces for wildlife species in anthropogenic landscapes. And the starting point of this idea is the relationship between the available space for wildlife and the diversity related. And as you can see on this figure, at a larger scale, 1% of the available land for wildlife species corresponds to 1% of diversity. That means that if we protect 50% of the global areas, we protect only 50% of diversity at the larger scale. So it's also a call for, it calls for a need to rethink how we share the landscape with wildlife species, to improve their capacity to persist in this kind of landscapes by increasing the proportion of land suitable for them. So in this study, we developed a methodology to assess wildlife occurrence and habitat suitability in anthropogenic landscapes using local knowledge. So we realized workshops to gather data, and then we modelize the species distribution, and it allowed us to interpret the participatory process itself and the modelization. So our study area is the George municipality in the Western Cape, which is part of the Greater Cape Floristic region, and it is also within the Gadutu National Park, which is a unique example of social ecological conservation strategy, because it's a network of protected areas connected by ecological corridors, critical biodiversity areas. So it's a mosaic of land uses. And this municipality, like many others in the Western Cape, is facing increasing challenges with coexisting issues, especially with the Chacma baboon. which is a very highly adapted species, and which causes economic damages as well as threat to populations. So we realized spatially stratified purposive sampling. That means that we contacted people potentially knowledgeable about baboons' occurrence in these areas. And by snowballing, we managed to get a significant pool of informants. So we organized 7 participatory mapping workshops, and we asked people to locate on a printed aerial imagery of the study area baboon occurrences. So when I've seen baboons in the past 3 years. And thanks to a grid clipped under the base map, we managed to report the GPS locations. And we built different data sets. So the dataset 1 is the one with all the observations, so 357 observations. And the dataset 2 is the dataset with at least 2 observations per unit. So it considers the reliability of the data. Concerning our environmental predictors, we were interested in the land cover with the Afrotropical forest, for example, fynbos, pine plantations, as well as rural agricultural or urban landscapes. We consider as well quantitative predictors, such as the distance to the closest protected area or closest critical biodiversity area, freshwater body, as well as slope and altitude. And we assessed the correlation between these variables to remove the highly correlated ones that we did with the altitude, which was very correlated to the slope, and we kept slope as it was more ecologically meaningful. We consider as well different biases correctors, such as the visibility. You get less chances to see a baboon in dense bushes rather than in urban landscapes. And we assessed this visibility across the landscape by putting a target in every land cover of a size of a baboon. And we measure the distance at which we don't see anymore the targets. And we did it 20 times in every land cover. And we managed to get a visibility index across our landscape. We consider as well the sampling. You get more chances to see a baboon in your garden rather than in the surrounding landscape. So we ask people to locate on the map where their household is, as well as their frequent visited site. And by compiling this data, we got a map of the sampling intensity across the landscape. We consider as well the road as a potential bias. You get more chances to see a baboon on the road and in more accessible areas rather than remote areas. So that's our 3 bias correctors. And we define the detectability as a combination of the 3 correctors. And we got as well a map of the detectability index. We did then a species distribution modelization using the algorithm Maxent, which use a presence-only data, which is very meaningful for this kind of study. But I'm not going too deep in this modelization thing, but if you have any questions, you're welcome. Yes, so the bias file is constraining the background point of the modelization. And then the question was to assess the validity of our models. So we did very classic metric analysis of our models, and it wasn't very informative because all the models were pretty good, above 0.8 of the training area under the curve. And that's very interesting because a lot of studies using the algorithm Maxent are just using the metric analysis to choose which model is the best. So we went back on the fields and we, in the under-surveyed areas, and we asked people if there is baboons or not. And it is interesting now because we have differences between models, and the model with detectability, so sampling, visibility, and road, is always better or equal to the null model. So that's the model that we kept for further analysis. So concerning the different data sets and the result of the modelization, you can see that depending on the data set, you have different distribution ranges. And for the data set 2, it's much more constrained. So it could be first because of the reliability of the data, but also it can have an ecological meaning because it can describe the core habitat of baboons, which is interesting for management planning and for targeted protected areas for the species. And the dataset one is more related to a prospective behavior and gives insight concerning the extent of the potential conflicts. Baboons are often found close to protected areas, and they are also very found in exotic plantations, which is interesting because we can assume that with the removal of these exotic plantations to conserve indigenous species, it could extend the conflict. So it's a low-cost methodology, 5 rands per square kilometers. The informant selection and data collection protocol is critical for participatory processes because it can change the ability to extrapolate, and it gives meaningful discussion for improving human-wildlife coexistence and to promote adaptive co-management. I really thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Eli. Are there questions for Eli? So, Eli, how much do you think the biology of the species that you are studying here influences the models that you got? Do you think if the biology was different, less social or whatever, that would affect the models that you got?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So the choice of the study area is very important for this species because we can observe that some troops of baboons are very adapted to a specific behavior. And so the choice of the study area is very important. In our case, we had several troops in our landscape, so we can have an overall trend of the baboon ecological range. But it will be very interesting also to assess the methodology with more cryptic species, such as leopards or caracals. So we started with the baboon because it's a very common species, very easy to find. Thank you.
Thank you again, Eli. We are now going to move into the last stretch for this session, where we are going to have 4 speed presentations. 2 of them are live in person, and the other 2 are live and virtual. And we're starting with a virtual one. What's going to happen, folks, is that we will run through the 4 talks, and then if there's any time left at the end of those 4 talks, we'll open it up for questions. So it's going to be quite rapid fire, where we'll start with Charlie De Vos, who's going to be telling us about pangolins. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Good afternoon, SAWMA, and a very warm welcome from and beyond Phinda Private Game Reserve. My name is Charlie De Vos, and today I'll be talking about assessing the feasibility of introducing Temminck's pangolin after being retrieved out of their wildlife trade and released back into a private game reserve in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. There are currently 4 different pangolin species found across the African continent, of which all these species are threatened by the intensive hunting and poaching for both their bushmeat as well as for pangolin scales and other body parts that are used in traditional African bush medicine. Apart from that, there's also an increase in the intercontinental illegal wildlife trade of pangolins due to a decline in the Asian pangolin populations as well as development-related factors in Africa. Secondary threats that face the African pangolin species are habitat loss as well as land management practices such as pesticide use and the installation of electrical fences that pose an often fatal threat. Pangolins have been locally extinct from Phinda in the Muniwana Conservancy for more than 40 years. However, this all changed in June 2019 when the first individuals were released back into the Conservancy. Since then, a total of 14 pangolins have been released. All of these individuals have been rescued and rehabilitated by the African Pangolin Working Group and the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital after being confiscated out of the illegal wildlife trade. Each of these pangolins are fitted with two devices, the first being a data logger tag and the second being a very high frequency telemetry tag. This allows for intensive post-release monitoring of these individuals, and the tags are fitted to the non-vascular region of the scales. The objectives of this project is to assess the feasibility of reintroducing pangolins back into an area from which they have gone locally extinct, and to provide future guidelines for other conservancies that would like to follow suit. It also aims to increase our understanding on pangolin ecology, including their home range, movement patterns, activity patterns, diet, and habitat preference, as well as any other factors that might affect this animal's behavior. To date, the project has attempted to reintroduce 14 individuals. However, 4 mortalities have been recorded, one due to biliary, another one was a predation event of which we suspect the culprit to be a crocodile, the other one unfortunately succumbed due to an electrical fence, and the last individual had to be euthanized as she was unfortunately not fit enough to be released back into the wild. 4 other individuals, however, lost their tags due to predator and other tag-related issues. However, since the inception of the project, 1 pup has been born onto the reserve, and another female suspected to have lost her pup shortly after giving birth. To date, 7 individuals are still being monitored. We have also noticed that more than 70% of individuals released back into the wild display territoriality, which can be seen in the slide. Other than that, a total of 34 occasions we've had to go and retrieve pangolins from high-risk areas. In other words, areas where they were too close to electrical fences or where they were too close to our communities. A total of 110 tag deployments has also taken place, as tags only last every 3 to 6 months. And a total of 28 veterinary consults have been conducted. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Next up is Kelly, and Kelly's going to be telling us about trophy hunting mesocarnivores. Thanks, Kelly.
Hi, thank you very much. Like Dan said, it's rapid fire before lunch because everyone's hungry. We're talking to you about trophy hunting of mesocarnivores using the serval as a case study. And just to acknowledge my co-author, Jeanette Celia, thank you. So, trophy hunting and the management thereof has really been focused on the big furry charismatic species. We've got a myriad of conservation planning documents on these animals. We've got non-detriment findings, NDFs, we've got biodiversity management plans, BMPs, we've got committees of inquiry, COEs, we've got high-level panels, HLPs, and a whole other variety of fruit salad of letters to try and manage these big charismatic species. And that's great. They've got them for leopards, lions, rhinos, cheetahs, you name it, the whole lot. But mesocarnivores are also hunted as trophies, but also many of them are considered to be damage-causing animals. So there's that off-take also related to mesocarnivores. But they also provide a very important function in the ecosystem in terms of the structure of the ecosystem, dynamics of the ecosystem. They're a very numerous group of animals. They've got very diverse in both their size and their behavior, and they're generally understudied. And any studies that are done generally aren't focused on informing our management decision-making around these species. We don't have any conservation planning decision-making around these species, despite them being utilized and despite them being removed as damage-causing animals. There's not one single BMP. There's a draft NDF for serval, which is really great. Our distribution maps are outdated. We don't even really know where they occur. And our research isn't really effectively focused on helping us to manage these species. So what am I talking about? I mean, they're just the little guys. They're not cute. I mean, they're not big and furry, and they don't really attract tourists. But we looked at the National Hunting Register to get an idea of the permits that are issued for trophy hunting of these mesocarnivores. Now, these figures don't include things like damage-causing animal offtake, roadkills, illegal trade, or anything like that. This is only for trophy hunting of these animals. And you can see the numbers are quite large, like 4,700 jackals, 2,200, got to stand further away from the screen so I can read it. Caracal, never get old, students, it's terrible. And 500 servals, and so it carries on. So you can see it's not an insignificant amount of numbers that are being hunted. And if we have a look at trends over time between 2010 and 2019 from the same database, what's really interesting is the increase in the trend in the application for hunting permits for serval. So we're going to use serval as an example because of that increase in trend and because I haven't analysed my data. So Leon had a dodgy study design and I don't have any data analysis. Between us, we've got a perfect paper. But if you look in the trends in hunting of serval over time per province in South Africa, so over that same time span from 2010 to 2019, the vast majority of our serval have been hunted in Mpumalanga province and Limpopo province. And what's interesting about this is that the returns that we get on these hunting events, we don't get any biological data from those. There's no real success rates. These are really just permits that have been applied for. So we don't know how many males, how many females, how old they were they successful. The serval is protected under TOPS, under NEMBA, so it is effectively protected. So it means all activities related to serval are protected, including hunting. But Mpumalanga doesn't implement TOPS, which complicates that, but they do have their provincial ordinance, which they utilise to protect many wildlife species. But there's no protection for the harvesting of serval under that ordinance. And this is just one example from one province. I'm not picking on the Mpumalanga guys. We've got similar problems in all the provinces. It's not just an Mpumalanga issue. But what we do know is that serval recolonise really well, and there's been some really amazing work done in Mpumalanga around servals used in these areas around sort of mines and power stations. And there's been some really cool photographs coming out of it. We've got servals with power stations in the background. And we're finding in these areas that serval occur at very high densities. They use quite small home ranges. And it's probably due to the presence of prey and many other things that, in those areas. That's really great. But as a response to that draft NDF, Mpumalanga have now developed a draft hunting register, which goes a really, really long way to ensure that our serval hunting is going to be much more sustainable in the long run. But now we don't just need it for Mpumalanga, we need it for all our provinces and for all our mesocarnivore species that are utilised. And whatever we put in place has to be easy to implement for government officials. We can't go and further burden government officials with more paperwork and more permit applications. And we can't do the same to the landowners. I think if we ask any landowners to do more applications for anything, they're going to get very, very grumpy with us. So whatever we need needs to be very admin light, and it needs to be incentive-based, not necessarily regulatory. So rather than putting the rules in place, well, if you do this and this and this right, then you can do that. But for this, we need to have some data that are suitable, that feed into this, these management regimes. So we need to update our distribution maps, get hands on some of the existing data like Yanni snapshot safaris, and then fill those gaps in distribution with rapid camera trapping surveys, and then do a proper analysis of this hunting database that I just drew two pretty graphs out of. But to do that, I need a master's student. So if you're keen and you're interested, it's with TUT and it's with SAMBI, and then be collaborating with all the provinces too. Please give me a shout. If you've got any friends, give me a shout, because I think it's a really cool, interesting project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. We're moving on then to our second last presentation of the session, which is Tamar. And Tamar is going to be telling us about the prevalence of snares in the Willand region of the Western Cape. Thanks very much, Tamar.
Good day, everyone. Today I'll be telling you about some of the findings of my master's, where I investigated wire snare poaching in the woodland. Traps have been used to capture animals for many thousands of years. However, snare trapping for bushmeat is intensifying in many areas. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is growing exponentially, resulting in the rising demand for cheap sources of protein and driving bushmeat harvesting. In South Africa, illegal wire snares are the most popular method of bushmeat harvesting because they are simple to set up, are relatively affordable, and the materials needed are normally easily accessible. Additionally, detecting snares is difficult, and the enforcement of laws banning their use is rare. However, snare poaching is indiscriminate, killing non-target and threatened species, and populations can be severely impacted. Few studies have explored wire snare poaching trends in southern Africa or on private agricultural lands. Data on snaring in the Fynbos biome is especially sparse. Snaring generally does not occur randomly in a landscape, so this study aimed to use data from wire snare patrols to investigate the intensity of use and spatial distribution of wire snares on private agricultural properties in the Boerland region of the Western Cape. On this map, you can see the study area. 210 snare patrols were carried out across 111 agricultural properties adjacent to mountainous protected areas. Most properties were patrolled twice. 649 anchored snares were found, shown in red, and I extrapolated absence points along the patrol routes. I investigated which socio-ecological property variables correlate with the number of snares which were found during the patrol. The only significant trends found were more snares where the farmer is resident on the property and where the primary agricultural output is orchards rather than vineyards or animal production. I originally hypothesized that having the farmer, an authoritative figure, present on the farm outside of work hours would discourage the setting of snares, but interestingly, the opposite trend was seen. It seems likely that anti-snaring regulations are not being enforced. This would make sense, as a previous study found that labourers in the region frequently believed they were permitted to use wire snares, while most farmers claimed that this was not the case. Historical grievances over land could also be playing a role. Many of the labourers who admitted to snaring expressed the opinion that if the farmer can hunt, they should be allowed to as well. Orchards had significantly higher snaring pressure, possibly because they attract certain preferred target species, such as porcupines who ringbark trees, duiker who eat young shoots, and feral pigs who are known to eat fallen fruit. The trees planted to form wind and fire breaks provide sturdy anchor points, and wire is readily available. Labourers working in the orchards would have easy access to these, so snares placed there could be checked without much extra effort. I also investigated the influence of anthropogenic structures and abiotic variables on snare placement across the landscape. Proximity to public streets was the most influential variable, with distance to rivers, elevation, and land use also playing a role. Snares were generally not found within 250 meters of the street, likely due to the higher human traffic and the increased risk of being seen. However, the probability of finding a snare increased sharply between 450 and 600 meters, and then decreased after 1,100 meters. Travel time and distance is a limiting factor for poachers, increasing the effort and cost required to both find the preferred target species and transport them once captured. There was also a strong interaction between distance to street and proximity to a protected area. This resulted in protected hotspots, which are often centered around protected areas, but which are not remote in terms of distance to public streets. This could result in further fragmentation of the landscape and exacerbate edge effects. In the Boerland, the highest snaring pressure was found where the farmer is resident on the property, where people have easy access to suitable land and materials, and where the preferred target species are likely attracted to the vegetation present. Bushmeat poaching is also likely to be a growing threat and should be a priority for the relevant conservation authorities. Time, manpower, and funds are almost always limited for conservation initiatives, so when the drivers and spatial patterns of wire snare poaching can be identified, anti-snaring efforts should be tailored to take these into account. Thank you for listening. I would like to thank everyone who made this project possible.
Thank you very much, Tamar. Our last presentation for this morning is by Jan, who, after wrangling some monitor lizards in his chalet yesterday, is going to tell us about crocodile-human conflict. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just be going through some of the most interesting findings from each of my 3 study sites, which is mostly based on my questionnaire data. I'm going to start with the Limpopo River. Okay. So in 2013, the Limpopo River flooded, which caused thousands of crocodiles to escape from the nearby Rakwena crocodile farm. And in the following months, the farm did manage to recapture many of their animals, but to this day, there are still thousands of their farm crocodiles out there. However, Despite the unnatural increase in the crocodile population numbers of the Limpopo River, so far there have been very few recorded cases of human-crocodile conflict. Of the cases there, it mostly consisted of attacks on dogs and livestock. There have been a few incidents of fishing rods being destroyed and a handful of attacks on humans. There have also been incidents where crocodiles chased people who were canoeing at the time, but the majority of attacks on humans occurred when the victim was fishing or crossing the river. However, it is possible that there may be many more unknown crocodile attacks on humans in the Limpopo River, specifically on illegal immigrants crossing the river from Zimbabwe into South Africa. Now, compared to the Limpopo River, the Lavuvu River is quite urbanized along many of its river banks, and there have been many more attacks on humans and domestic animals, especially dogs, in the Lavuvu River. But human-crocodile conflict in the Nandoni Dam, which is fed by the Lavuvu River, is unheard of, and some people have theorized that this could be a difference in fish stocks between the dam and the river. It is said that the dam is full of fish, which is the crocodile's main food source, whereas at Lavuvu River there aren't that many fish, so the crocodiles turn to alternative prey, which includes humans and their animals. And many fishermen have been attacked in the river, and many women get attacked while fetching water. What is even more concerning is that there are at least 5 primary schools quite close to the Lavuvu River, and the children there are being taught absolutely nothing about crocodiles or how to stay safe in their habitat, which means when summer comes, the children go swimming in that same river. There is immense anthropogenic pressure on that river for its natural resources. When you go there, you'll see people extracting water from the river using water pumps. You'll see the construction of brick ovens alongside the banks of the dam and the river, and unfortunately there's also a lot of pollution. Now, the Olifants River is like the Lavuvu River in that it is also quite urbanized on some of its riverbanks, and there have also been a lot of attacks on humans and livestock, though not as many as at Lavuvu. And some of the riskiest activities one can do in the Olifants River is to go fishing, especially with nets, which has led to many attacks on fishermen. People also get attacked while fetching water, crossing the river every day to go to work on the farm, or swimming, and even on occasion canoeing. There have been 1 or 2 poaching incidents near the Olifants River where crocodiles were poached for their meat, skins, or body parts for use in traditional medicine. And crocodiles have also moved into the farm dams on the southern side of the Olifants River, leading to attacks there. And some people have blamed overfishing in the river, especially at villages such as Finale and the Oaks, for depleting the crocodile's main food source, forcing them to look for food somewhere else. Yeah. And so here are just some of the conclusions I've made so far in my study and 1 or 2 recommendations. It seems that most human-crocodile conflict occurs in the Lavuvu River, with 63 recorded incidents in total. Fishermen not only risk life and limb while fishing, but they also risk financial ruin when expensive fishing equipment gets destroyed by crocodiles. And it seems that encounters between humans and crocodiles will most likely increase due to the increasing human population, as well as the increasing development alongside the rivers. And it is my belief that future research into human-crocodile conflict in South Africa should also focus on other things like domestic animal losses, pet losses, damage to property, and not focus on trends in attacks on humans like it currently is. And finally, there is a strong need for a croc-wise environmental education program where people are being taught about crocodiles and their biology and how they can stay safe in their habitat. And the primary target audiences should definitely be young children, as well as anyone who relies on resources directly taken from the river in order to conduct their daily chores and support their livelihoods. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jan, and to all the speed presenters. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, so if you have any questions here in the hall, you can ask them. I'm going to ask the first one. I'm going to ask Kelly if she has any idea of the kinds of incentives that you would put in place to try and protect some of these, or not protect, but the incentives to comply rather than using the stick. What kind of incentives do you think you'd use? The work that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just having this discussion on the YouTube channel, actually. So I don't know if you were stealing our ideas of the YouTube channel, Dan. But I mean, there are ways of doing it that don't have to be very admin heavy for the landowners, that don't require massive surveys with high precision, that you've got to know exactly how many, say, serval you have and what age groups. And there's been a lot of this type of stuff done for other carnivores like lions and leopards. We don't actually need to know how many there are. You know that you can harvest so many of a certain age group with a non-patchy offtake or something like that, and that's quite sustainable. So I think there are ways of doing it that it won't be maybe incentive-based in that, it could be if you've got a serval population like we do for the leopard hunting zones. So we've got a model for leopard hunting zones where if you can show in your leopard hunting zone that your leopard population is stable to increasing and you've got male leopards older than 7 years of age, then you can get a hunting permit for that male leopard. And that indirectly, well, almost directly actually, incentivizes the landowner to have a leopard population on his property that is stable to increasing. So, there's sort of that way around of doing it. And I think we could probably work something similar for the mesocarnivores if we really thought out of the box and had the right information to be able to manage the mesocarnivores. But right now, we don't even know where they are or how many their ages or even what models would work. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. I know that it is late in the session, but if there are any burning questions, we'll take them. It doesn't seem like it, which is fine. If you do have questions, comments, please go on to YouTube and put those comments in. It's wonderful to see the interaction going on online. It's great that we are having an impact. It's wonderful to note that between 60 and 80 people are viewing the conference, that some of them are here, but most of them are somewhere else. So thank you for your engagement, all the virtual presenters and the virtual delegates who are watching from afar. I just have a few announcements before we go to lunch. The lunch packs are outside, so you can just go and collect them and go and find a place to sit. Quickly, the student quiz is still open, so anybody, any students who'd like to enter a team, you may do so until dinner this evening. A reminder to students, please make sure that you let Elma know which degree you're doing so she can have that listed. Dinner tonight will be in the same place, just down below us here in the Boma area. And the last announcement is that our first poster session will be immediately after the afternoon talks today, and we will screen half of them here in the hall. So please come along, posters 1 to 12, I think it will be, here in the hall, so please take a few moments to do that. My last job this morning is to thank all the speakers, especially our plenary speaker who navigated the urns, switching the screen on and off extremely professionally and gave an excellent presentation. Thank you to all the presenters and have a great lunch, everybody.